Magda Brazen Outlaw is a commander-centric combo deck that revolves around treasures. It is also a toolbox deck. There are 4 different archetypes within Magda, as far as the type of decks that pilots actually play. You have midrange, which is the most common. You have hard stacks, which relies on layering stacks in order to get into the late game and then be able to present a combo. You have turbo stacks, which looks to do that but faster, basically taking out some of the stacks pieces in order to gain speed. Then you have pure turbo, which pure turbo Magda is still slower than other turbo decks in the format, so it's not something that gets played very often. And then you have midrange, which is basically soft stacks, that uses the best of the best silver bullets that the format has to offer, at least that don't impact our deck all that much. Some example of these effects are Grafdigger's Cage, which is the best stacks piece in the format as it stops breach. It also stops reanimation, and it stops 2-field tutors, as well as casting things from graveyard and casting things from library. You then have ways to shut off activated abilities in Pithing Needle and Disruptor Flute, with Disruptor Flute having the secondary effect of also being able to shut down specific win lines. So as an example, if you're playing against a food chain deck that is looking to use Squee, then you can name Squee with Disruptor Fruit, and it will cost them 6 mana as opposed to 3. So instead of them generating 4 mana, netting 1 mana each time, they're going to be net negative. You then have Vexing Bauble as a way to stop free spells. This also is a way to protect combo pieces that might be in your hand from getting countered, or more easily countered. This usually consists of Clock of Omens and Maskwood Nexus, or potentially Lifecraft Engine. So this is usually a tutor target only when Clock of Omens is in play, or if you're playing against an Atali or something and need an answer. Additionally, turning off ETBs can be very important, especially against things like Orcish Bowmaster. If your opponent is trying to cast a Thassa's Oracle to win the game, you can tutor this in response to stop the ETB from happening. And then there's plenty of other ETBs in the format. This shuts off Atali. This shuts off basically most of the creatures in Rocco. There's a lot of tertiary creatures in various decks that have quite a bit of value, like Ranger Captain can no longer go and get your opponent their Esper Sentinel or their Mockingbird or whatever it is that they're going to be playing. We then have Damping Sphere. This is a way to stop opponents from storming off. It can make protecting your wins very difficult for your opponents. And in addition to this, it also acts as a way to hose Cradle decks, as it makes Gaia's Cradle make 1 colorless mana instead of a buttload of green. We then have Unlicensed Hearse, which is a way to control the graveyard in a way, and a tempo piece in Portal to Phyrexia. This allows you to remove 3 creatures from each opponent's board, and then as long as a Grafdigger's Cage isn't in play, you can bring a creature back every upkeep for you. So if your board gets wiped, Portal to Phyrexia can help get those creatures back into play. The main game plan for the deck is very simple. You are looking to leverage all of your dwarves to generate treasures. This requires them to be tapped, which means that running things that allow you to tap your creatures without going to combat is quite important. For this, we use things like Dwarven Bloodboiler and vehicles, such as Smuggler's Copter, Flywheel Racer, Unlicensed Hearse, Lifecraft Engine, and then we do have a land that does it at sorcery speed in Caveron Memorial World. Outside of that, once you have established enough treasures to activate Magda, you are then looking to put yourself in a position to win the game or interact with opponents. So, if you're looking to win the game, you're looking to combo off. This usually requires 10 treasures, so that you can get an artifact dwarf like Roaming Throne, along with Clock of Omens. If this is not available to you because Clock of Omens is stuck in hand or um, exiled or in the graveyard already or whatever, then we have Maskwood Nexus alongside Battered Golem and a tap outlet, because Battered Golem has a triggered ability. Whenever an artifact comes into play, you may untap Battered Golem. So when it is a dwarf, it crews a vehicle, makes a treasure, the treasure comes in, untaps him. And then we have other ways to make infinite treasures without Clock of Omens, using a combination of multiple Roaming Thrones and Xorns to generate enough treasures that with the correct set of creatures that you can make infinite treasures. Otherwise, you're looking to hold up interaction using the silver bullets and Stax pieces that I talked about earlier. A very common gameplay pattern is to get to 5 treasures, get Roaming Throne, make 6 treasures the following turn, and then try to win. One important thing about Magda that you must understand is that her combos are extremely fragile. Magda herself, Roaming Throne, or your artifact dwarf specifically, usually X ones, are easiest to get rid of because Bowmaster exists. But other than that, Clock of Omens, Maskwood Nexus, specific things in specific combos are the linchpin of how the combo works. So if it can be removed, and Magda does not have a SWAT effect, like deflecting SWAT, redirect lightning, etc., or a counterspell to your bounce spell, like Red Blast, Pyroblast, Tibalt Trickery, then it's relatively easy to interact with and stop Magda's combos. The other big downside of Magda is that everything is above board, and everything as far as your threat is on board. If you have an artifact dwarf on board, your opponents should be very scared, because if you get to 5 treasures, you can potentially just win the game, right? So it's very beneficial to potentially sandbag creatures like Universal Automaton, Metallic Mimic, or 3-Tree Mascot that are low-costing artifact dwarves, so they can be played after you get to 5 treasures. But obviously that's not always going to be a play pattern that you can have. You may need these artifact dwarves to make the treasures in early game to get to the point where you can either present a win or interact with the board. But otherwise, the deck is very simple, but also extremely complicated. If you don't have a lot of experience in the format, Magda can be quite difficult to pilot in Politic, because even though her combos are something that you can learn relatively simply, the way that you have to navigate games can be quite difficult. There's a reason why a lot of pilots just put Magda in the ground when they're playing against them. They don't know how to play against Magda properly, or they understand how Magda works and recognize the board state as being very dangerous and just want that to not exist. The other thing is people don't like you being able to hold leverage over their head. So Magda having an activation is problematic because your opponents then have to worry about all of the things that you could be doing to stop their win attempt. So defensively tutoring is not really where you want to be as Magda. Being able to threaten doing so is usually enough to stop opponents from trying to push, but sometimes opponents are going to take their window of opportunity no matter what and force you to use your activation. And that's something that you have to accept. And these type of games usually lead to draws. 2025 has come and gone, and we've gained access to a lot of new interesting cards to our card pool. The deck also has had some philosophical changes, at least as far as the mid-range variant of the deck goes. There are still the three other archetypes as well: Turbo, Hard Stax, and Turbo Stax. We'll go over all the different variants of that in a bit, and sort of do a compare and contrast, just like the last iteration of this type of primer. But I want to start by going over all the different cards that we've gotten in 2025 and how they impact the deck. The first card that we got this year was in Aetherdrift, and that is Lifecraft Engine. It's not quite as powerful as, say, Roaming Throne, but it is still incredibly important to gaining consistency in the deck, because it's a vehicle that is also a dwarf that turns all other vehicles into dwarves, while providing a +1/+1 anthem, making it so that your dwarves are harder to kill with Bowmaster. So this is a very powerful effect, because once a vehicle is crewed, it can crew another vehicle. So Lifecraft Engine, once crewed, can crew another vehicle, and then that vehicle can crew Lifecraft Engine, making treasures. It's also something that is tutorable through Grafdigger's Cage to give us extra consistency to find ways to win there. Having a tutor target when you manage to draw multiple vehicles is also not a bad thing either. And it's a little less threatening, though still threatening, than a Roaming Throne. It's also a little bit harder to interact with because the crew has to fully resolve before it can be bounced. And then you can crew in response to the bounce, etc., etc. So the biggest issue for this card is that it is a vehicle and it is very powerful. So it can attract a lot of attention as far as how often this thing may get countered. But outside of that, it is just a boon to our deck. There is nothing bad that you can really say about it, and it will be a staple forever. The next card we got was from a secret lair, and that is Knuckles the Echidna. Double Strike, Trample, Haste. The Double Strike Trample is very important because if a creature dies from the first hit, you will still hit your opponent for the second hit regardless. So if it's an X1, you will get 2 treasures. If it is an X2, you will get 1. So it is essentially a 4-mana version of Professional Facebreaker that instead of getting the sacrifice a treasure and exile the top card of your library that can be played this turn, you have Treasure Hunter instead, which is at the beginning of your upkeep. If you control 30 or more artifacts, you win the game. Knuckles is a little bit annoying to cast because of the double red sometimes, but having to use a treasure isn't that bad, because Knuckles usually will make you 2 treasures the turn that it comes down. It's hard to block. It is something that has 4 toughness, so it's also hard to kill. It's just a very powerful card, and if there's ever a board state where you're able to attack with multiple creatures, then you're going to get as much value out of this as a Professional Facebreaker, and then slightly more because this creature usually goes unblocked. Next we have Gogo Mysterious Mime. This is from the Commander deck in Final Fantasy, or one of them, and it's the closest thing that we've gotten to a win the game card outside of Roaming Throne. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may have Gogo become a copy of another target creature you control until the end of turn, except its name is Gogo Mysterious Mime. If you do, Gogo and that creature each get +2/+0, and gain haste until the end of turn, and attack this turn available. So this is incredibly potent with Magda, because it gives you 2 copies of Magda. Each time that you tap a dwarf, you will make 2 treasures. So with Magda and Gogo alone, you will make 4 treasures. If you have a 3rd creature, you will get an activation. You can circumvent the needs to attack portion if you have access to a vehicle, obviously. This scales quite well because if you have Roaming Throne, it will add triggers to both creatures, because they will both be dwarves. So you'll get 4 treasures when something is tapped because you'll have 2 Gogo triggers and 2 Magda triggers. This can get out of hand quite easily and lead to some very hard to interact with combo lines, where your opponent needs to make the hard decision of, do I wait for clock? What are they going to tutor for, etc. And you can take it a bunch of different ways, which I'll go over later. The other important thing about this card is that if the opponent has removal, getting rid of Gogo as opposed to Magda is always the correct decision, because if you remove Magda, and then Magda is replayed the following turn, then Gogo and Magda just do the exact same thing together. That being said, there are also times where you will have access to things like Professional Facebreaker or Knuckles, where Gogo and Knuckles, as an example, would be quite the duo to deal with, because Knuckles has double strike and trample, and gives you a treasure each time that you connect with an opponent. Gogo does the exact same thing, or would do the exact same thing. And the +2/+0 would make it so that they're both 4/4s with double strike. So that's 16 damage to an Adnos player, or anyone playing Necropotence or whatever, which is quite hard to deal with, or at least puts them off of that as a main game plan, potentially, or limits their outs. There's also some other situations where Gogo can become other things, but they are few and far between. You know, having it become a copy of Xorn, if you don't have access to other things, so that you can get rid of your treasure vault and make 2 extra treasures instead. It's convoluted, but they may come up 1 in 1,000 games. The card is insane, and it's as close to another copy of Roaming Throne as we can hope to get without just getting another Roaming Throne. Edge of Eternities brought us 2 new cards. Caveron Memorial World, a land that enters tapped, makes red, and has Station, which is sorcery speed crew. It also has the ability to pay 1 of the red, sacrifice a land, not just this one, and then create a 2/2 colorless robot artifact creature token. And creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain haste until the end of turn. This is mostly irrelevant, but it can matter based on a card that we got in Lorwyn Eclipse, which I'll go over later. But this was not on our bingo card, at least for the Magda community, as far as what we expected to get. We didn't expect to have another clown car attached to a land, essentially. Sorcery speed sucks, but if people have interaction, they have interaction no matter what. You're going to get blown out. So it doesn't matter if it's sorcery speed or not. Next we have Tezzeret Cruel Captain. 3 mana, which puts it right at the sweet spot for our deck as far as powerful things. Whenever an artifact you control enters, put a loyalty counter on Tezzeret. So this counts for treasures. So if you have 2 dwarves, you're basically guaranteed to be adding at least 2 loyalty to him. And then its 0 is untap target artifact or creature. If it's an artifact creature, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So this allows you to untap the One Ring. It allows you to untap things like Mana Vault or Soul Ring or whatever, so that you can power out other things from your hand. I've had games where I've gone turn 1, Mana Vault, into Tezzeret, untap my Mana Vault, played something like Unlicensed Hearse and an Artifact Dwarf. And those type of starts are insane, because at that point, Tezzeret is 6 loyalty, and it's going to be very difficult to get him down to the point where you can't use his -3 the next turn, which is search your library for an artifact card with mana value 1 or less, reveal it and put it into your hand, and then shuffle. So the -3 is really, really powerful, because it is able to get us Clown Car, unlike from Urza's Saga, because it's 1 or less, and X is less. It gets us lands. So if someone is going to politic countering this, you can just say, oh, I'm going to go get an artifact land instead. This is either going to be Great Furnace or Treasure Vault. All of our 1-drops that have a lot of value, like Grafdigger's Cage or Soul Ring or Mana Vault, there's so many different things in our deck that are viable. And then obviously you have Universal Automaton. So getting multiple tutors with this thing can potentially just win you the game by giving you access to Clown Car and a Robot Dwarf. And then you have his -7, which is you get an emblem at the beginning of combat on your turn, put 3 +1/+1 counters on target artifact that you control. If it's not a creature, it becomes a 0/0 robot artifact creature. So this can help turn your treasures into an army of 3/3s over time. So this card is insane. It is a staple and will probably never come out of the deck. The next card that we got is Peter Parker's Camera from Spider-Man. 1 mana, so it's very easy to deploy. This artifact enters with 3 film counters on it. You can pay to tap it, remove a film counter, and then copy target activated or triggered ability you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. So, let's go back to Tezzeret. This allows you to double the activated abilities of your Planeswalker. So you can get double searches. This allows you to double the treasure generation that you get for one of Magda's triggers, because you're able to copy it. Or, you're able to copy a Magda activation. This is very flexible. It also allowed us to increase card quality, because at some point, the deck went off of Spine of Isha and used Grinding Station as a backup win condition, sort of to save the day if you didn't have access to Roaming Throne for the Pinnacle Monk line or Barkform Harvester. This was just an independent win line. It also got rid of our own Grafdigger's Cage, which is also pretty important. Peter Parker's Camera, however, allows us to do the Pinnacle Monk combo line without access to Roaming Throne, because you're just able to copy the ETB. That means that you can gain some card quality while still being able to remove your own Grafdigger's Cage. Legion Extruder went into the deck, and it's something that Rust and myself had been testing for a while, even before Peter Parker's Camera came out. It's very, very potent. Being able to get rid of your own Grafdigger's Cage, being able to gain access to 3/3 golems in board states where things are stalled out, and you can generate a board that can potentially kill someone over, the long term. But also, it's just sorcery speed removal. Or something that can be tutored through Grafdigger's Cage to remove an important piece, like a Kiki Jiki trying to win the game, or a Aboro Breeze Caller, or a Kinnan, or whatever, right? There's a lot of things in the format 2 or less toughness that just die to this, and having single target removal for some of those things when not playing Spine of Isha anymore, or Spine of Isha-like effects, is pretty potent. And it being only 2 CMC as opposed to something like 7 makes this card way better. So this also is a combo line, and Peter Parker's Camera allows you to gain this card quality because it does do the Pinnacle Monk thing as a backup line when you don't have Roaming Throne or Barkform Harvester. Without that, the Magdanomicon itself would still probably be on Grinding Station, as opposed to Legion Extruder. Next we have Avatar, and this brought us Redirect Lightning, a 1-mana SWAT that we can pay 5 life, and change the target of target spell or ability with a single target. This is obviously one of our best ways to protect Magda, and decent stack interaction to help in situations where, there are just not enough counter spells to stop the person trying to present a win. The first set of 2026 is Lorwyn Eclipsed, and this brings us a very hyped card in Furdock Core. 3 mana, Kindred Artifact Shapeshifter Changeling. Tap, add 1 mana of any color.
Pay 4. This artifact becomes a 4/4 artifact creature until the end of turn. This is deceptive. You don't need to activate it to become a creature. It is a dwarf at all times because of the word kindred, and the fact that it has changeling on it. So this is just a mana rock that when you tap it, makes a treasure, meaning that it is a artifact dwarf that is not susceptible to creature removal, only susceptible to counterspells, which almost every counterspell in the format hits this, or bounce spells or Besage You or whatever. And obviously, we have stuff like Abrade, but those sort of effects aren't seen very much. If you are politically savvy, you can get this to resolve more often than not, but there are some prisoner's dilemma sort of situations that you might put yourself in if you try to do that. But this card is still very powerful. And then we have Stalactite Dagger. 2 colorless, which is the important part, for when this equipment enters, create a 1/1 colorless shapeshifter creature token with changeling. It's every creature type. So just this line alone this is a 2 colorless mana for a dwarf, which is not bad. And then you have the equipment portion, which is when it is equipped creature gets +1/+1 and is all creature types. So this is from, one of the older sets, basically Rune Stalactite, or an upgrade to it. So this attached to Battered Golem is just a win. This attached to a vehicle after it has been crewed and is a creature can then combo with Clock of Omens. So there's a lot of situations where this is very powerful, including situations where, like, you have a Xorn in play, you're at 6 treasures. Okay, I can tutor for Stalactite Dagger, tap, make 2 treasures. Cool. Now, from here, you can equip Stalactite Dagger to Xorn, tap, make 2 treasures. You're now back at 5, and then you can tutor for Clock of Omens, and then attach this to your vehicle and present a win. Just as an example. So this card is very powerful. It is a 4 mana win condition, basically, which is kind of where you want to be at for your mana usage for wins. It fits right in with, Gogo, Roaming Throne, and Clock of Omens / Maskwood Nexus themselves. So it's about as good as we can want from a win condition, as it's only 2 mana to start and gives us a body that can generate treasures for us. There's also been a change to the Magdanomicon. It has been split into 2 different sections. One section that still plays Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon, or Moon effects, and another one that does not. The reason for this is because, through my experience and the experience of a lot of other pilots, Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon weren't doing what we wanted it to. There were too many situations where these cards ended up just either potentially giving opponents the game if they were played, or turning off important interaction from our opponents, and we are a relatively parasitic deck, so it's not something you really want to do in the mid-game. So unless this is out turn 1 or turn 2, and manages to last more than 1 turn cycle, it doesn't really do anything. There are certainly the games where you do resolve it early, it sticks, and then you just walk to a win. But in my experience, and the experience of a couple other pilots that I trust, this just wasn't happening enough for us. There are a lot of, people that still like these cards and still feel like they have enough value to them, where they experience that shutting people out of the game, walking to a win scenario quite often, or potentially getting a draw or whatever. But the other issue with these cards is that since the dockside ban, getting to situations where you're able to lock down the game are a little bit harder, because before you would play Blood Moon or Magus of the Moon, and your first tutor would be Null Rod when dockside existed, which would shut all artifact mana off and allow you to essentially copy dockside and then just win that way. by making enough treasures with Dockside to get Battered Golem, Maskwood Nexus, and Dwarven Bloodboiler. But getting to that point now without Dockside is not very easy. So even if you're able to get something like a God Pharaoh statue into play on turn 4 or turn 5, after playing this on turn 1 or turn 2, you still need to get to the point where you're able to turn that corner. And a lot of players still play as much fast mana and as many of the important 2 mana rocks as they need to. So this only does so much to put people off of their main game plan. And especially as Thrasios decks have become more popular, Thrasios can still thrive in situations even if they don't have access to their Cradle, because they still get card draw off of colorless mana. They can still use the little colorless or the little green mana they have available to them to go and get their Seedborn Muse, or go and get their Biomancer's Familiar so that they can get extra card draw, or any combination of things, right? So, just like all of the Stax pieces, these are still susceptible to counters, and I can't tell you how many times that, personally, Magus of the Moon was removed in the first turn cycle that it was down, either immediately to a bounce spell, because someone was, like, holding up their Underground Sea, trying to use a Vampiric Tutor and being like, nope, can't do that, have to Flood Maw your Magus now. And then you just Time Walk yourself. That happened at least 4 or 5 times for me in tournament. And it's just very hard to resolve a Blood Moon if people have interaction at all. So, especially as the meta is moving more towards turbo-centric things, if mid-range decks are holding interaction, with us being more parasitic, we don't want it being used on our own stuff, right? Because then it's not able to be held up for the turbo player that's going to try to win on turn 2, turn 3. And sure, you can maybe politically leverage these sort of effects into resolving because of that, but it's not always going to be the case. Well, yes, a lot of that interaction is free. In certain situations, obviously, one piece might not stop those players, so the players that are playing more responsibly might need access to their blue mana or something, and that may not come from their mana rocks. So it really depends on the pod dynamic and all that stuff. There's a lot of volatility to these cards, and that's the main reason why a lot of us have moved away from them, is because there is so much volatility to them, and a vast majority of the time they end up just getting pitched to Chrome Mox or sitting in your hand doing nothing, because the game state doesn't allow you to play this without potentially king-making someone or throwing the game. So that's why these effects have been removed from the main Magdanomicon list, but because there is still merit to this sort of effect, I do maintain another version of the Magdanomicon that plays these effects in the considering section. So if you as a pilot like these effects and they are useful in your meta, then you should follow that version rather than the front-facing version of the deck. Also, if you're interested in getting more information as to why the Blood Moon effects have been removed from the list other than this small explanation, there is a 30-minute video going over a lot more things in depth that I'll be linking in the description of the video as well. So I want to go over some of the other cards that have been removed over time that saw play over the past year, because it's important to note why they were played and how they ended up shaking out, at least in the post-Dockside meta. The first thing we're going to talk about is Mox Diamond. So the main reason Mox Diamond was removed is the play patterns that it required, the type of hands that it required, and it being an entirely dead card in the mid-game, or I should say outside of your opening hand.
And yes, you can argue that you're only playing for your first 7 or your first 7 plus your first 4 draws as Magda. Absolutely. But if those first 4 draws, any of them are Mox Diamond, it's not usually getting played because you're playing your lands out on curve. The only time it's really useful is if you have a red land and a colorless land, or you have 2 colorless lands where it can produce the red that you need. So Mox Diamond and then 2 or more lands, as an example, in your opening 7 is 3.58%. This assumes 26 actual lands, so 29 with 3 MDFCs, or 29 total with 3 MDFCs, or 28 total with 2 MDFCs. So 26 pitchable cards, right? And then your second 7 is 7%-ish, and then your Multa 6 is 10.37%. So once you go below 6, Mox Diamond ends up being the thing that is most likely pitched, unless you have a very specific hand like 2 Dwarves on turn 1 or something, into a Magda on turn 2. So you need very specific types of hands the lower your mulligans are for it to even be relevant. And your best hands are your opening 7 or second 7 with 3 or more lands and Mox Diamond. However, because of that, you only have 3 cards available in your hand that can further your game plan, which usually puts you off of interaction in most cases, because you need likely either Dwarf or Dwarf Vehicle or something of that nature to get the most out of having the access to the early mana. Mana without anything to do with it in our deck doesn't matter, unfortunately. And unlike other decks that can draw into lands that can be pitched to the Mox Diamond that's in your hand, we don't have that luxury. So instead, we moved back to Chrome Mox because for a while some of us were off of Chrome Mox. We didn't like losing red cards, but there is a lot more flexibility in stuff like Gemstone Caverns and Chrome Mox opposed to Mox Diamond, especially as we use more and more MDFCs. The next card of importance that was removed is Spine of Isha. This was originally replaced with Grinding Station, and Grinding Station also replaced Engineer and Agatha's Soul Cauldron, which acted as another win condition. So the reason for that is that Goblin Engineer is just slow. Even if you get it out on turn 1, you still need artifacts, and in that case, getting rid of your fast mana usually, that you could trade for the thing in your graveyard. So it's also extremely telegraphed, unless you're running Curse Mirror, in which case you need an extra artifact in order to even do that variant of the combo, and an extra red mana. So it was extremely resource inefficient, just to, potentially confuse your opponents as to what you're going to get. So in this case, you're going to end up getting a, Lifecraft Engine, or a Peter Parker's Camera, or a Grafdigger's Cage, or whatever, into the graveyard so that you can have access to it. But realistically, it was just too slow. It was an important potential card to have when you needed access to a win, could remove this, and then use Agatha's Soul Cauldron after we removed Spine of Isha. Because there were only so many ways that you could close out a game that may still be in your deck after using the One Ring and Clock of Omens to draw enough cards to find removal for your own Grafdigger's Cage. So this set of cards was removed for Grinding Station as a consolidated win condition that acted as the backup plan that Engineer and Soul Cauldron did, along with some other things potentially, and just solved the problem of what if I don't have my Roaming Throne? What if I don't have my Barkform Harvester? So it was a 3-card combo that got consolidated down to 1, as removing our own Grafdigger's Cage is usually what Spine of Isha was used for, because if you were defensively tutoring for Spine of Isha, you were almost never winning that game.
from my experience. And also similarly, because there's no more dockside in the format, getting to the point where you can defensively tutor and then tutor again offensively, like using spine to remove something that's stopping you from winning, and then getting the piece that would allow you to win after that Stax piece has been removed, like blind obedience, right? That's not really a thing. There are certainly a few decks in the format that play blind obedience, like Shurikai, potentially Marnius, potentially Tivit, a couple other decks, but it's not as commonplace as it used to be. So the value of something like a Spine of Isha went down considerably, considering all of our other like silver bullets dealt with the problems at hand. You don't need to remove the Underworld Breach with Spine of Isha. You can just go get Grafdigger's Cage. And especially now that we have Lifecraft Engine and, you know, potentially we're playing more Artifact Wars than we were before, like Ferdot Core and stuff, you have a much higher chance of still being able to win those games compared to just removing the thing with Spine. Because you're able to potentially stop other people's wins as well. The next thing that was seen for a long time was Academy Manufacturer, and this was removed because it's like Goblin Engineer, just too slow. It doesn't really do anything. The clues in the food are helpful, mostly because the clues can give you card draw, but with how prevalent Bowmaster has been, and probably will be until it gets banned, 2 for 1ing yourself by cracking a clue is not really what you want to be doing. And that did happen a couple times to me, where both Magda and another dwarf died, and then I was completely out of the game. That being said, there were combo lines that existed to win with this without Clock of Omens. The fact that the clue in the food helped you, protect your Clock of Omens win only mattered if people interacted after Clock of Omens was in play. If they just removed Magda in response, usually within the next turn cycle, you lost the game anyway. So it ended up being a do-nothing card over the long term, unfortunately. And similarly, Mirror the Forebears was used as a combo piece with this or Xorn, or potentially was an Artifact Dwarf. The problem is, when it enters, you have to choose the creature type. So if you chose Assembly Worker or you chose Elemental, you were locked out of using this for dwarves. You could no longer, have it become a copy of Magda, and then there's a removal spell, and then you have it become a copy of Magda on top of that. That stuff was few and far between. You could either commit to this being just an Artifact Dwarf, or use it for combos. And playing this from hand, telegraphing what it was going to be doing, could be dangerous, right? As far as, if there is removal, there's only one Assembly Worker, and there's only one Elemental, unless you have Maskwood Nexus in play. The next card that has been removed, at least from the Magdanomicon, is Flare of Duplication. There are still a lot of pilots that play this. My reasoning for not playing this card is that it's almost entirely a defensive card. Because in the first 3 turns of the game, if you are sacrificing a dwarf, you are getting rid of treasure generation, and if you are not getting a roaming throne in exchange, you are net negative, in most cases. Or, specifically, if someone gives you a demonic tutor, and you know you're in a pod where you need a Grafdigger's Cage, that Grafdigger's Cage also needs to resolve. So, there's so many times where, personally, I've went to copy something offensively, had the original spell countered, which also counters my Flare of Duplication as there's no target, and then I've sacrificed a dwarf to do that. So I'm getting 2 for 1. I now am at least going to be a turn or 2 behind due to lack of treasure generation, and the chance of me winning that game goes down substantially. However, the defensive aspect of this card is very powerful, being able to be that last counterspell on the stack. or copying someone's silence, right? Or potentially using this to make sure that a culling ritual doesn't give the mana to the Golgari player, right? There are still some situations where it's worth getting rid of your creature, especially in the culling ritual situation, because you're going to lose it anyway, right? So, yes, there are some very large upsides that can happen, but the volatility behind this card is just too high, from me at least. And then the last card I really want to talk about is Siege Smash, which, depending on your meta, if you're in Rogthras plus Kin and Country, it can be a very powerful card because there's no way that they can, untap their Basalt Monolith in response to you doing this, right? Or destroying their thing when they're trying to Hullbreak or Horror Loop it or whatever, right? It's a very powerful card. It almost never was used for Protect Magda from Bowmaster or whatever, the second effect. But if there is enough artifacts that you need to remove, Siege Smash can do the job. It's just so specialized that as the meta diversifies, or has been diversifying, its value isn't quite as high. So it had been removed from the list as card quality and other aspects have gone up. For a while, the deck was on Gloin and Ghibli. The problem is our card quality has gone up so much that these cards aren't quite as good. While Gloin can give you, 2 treasures over 2 turn cycles, or Gimli, if he connects, can, make a bajillion treasures if you have, like, Knuckles or whatever. Like, it's really funny when you have Roaming Throne plus a Facebreaker effect or whatever with Gimli, but those are Magical Christmas Land, right? Most of the time, this card just dies to Bowmaster because it comes in after Magda, and yeah. So these 2 cards, while they were strong for a little while, have just been outclassed by other things. Godpharaoh's Statue has been in and out of the list over the past year. Depending on who you ask, it's either a very good card or one of the worst cards in the deck. I am more on the side of it being a bad card. And the reason for this is because, although yes, it does provide us a way to, on our own turn, win through the One Ring Protection or Angel's Grace or whatever, we technically have a answer to the Angel's Grace problem with Stalactite Dagger and gaining priority when an equipment falls off of a vehicle when it turns back into an artifact. And the One Ring thing is only a problem if it's the last turn of the game, because otherwise you just kill your other opponents, force the upkeep on the One Ring player, and then just kill them. So the value of the opponents losing 1 life each turn is not very high. So then you have the spells your opponents cast cost 2 more to cast. This particular card costs 6 mana. Playing this from hand is almost never happening, and if you do, if anyone has a counter, it will get countered. If you manage to thread the needle and find a window to cast it where there's no counters, great. Maybe you walk to a win. But specifically, this card as a tutor target is not usually going to be the first tutor of the game, because it requires your opponents to all have kept very slow hands and not have enough access to mana, where Godpharaoh's Statue essentially forces a rule of law type game. And you also need a board state where you can either guaranteed get attacks, so you're playing against a Rogsai type deck, or where you have access to a vehicle already. So because vehicles are only going to be in about 50% of our games, on average, based on the math of, seeing them in your opening hands or whatever, it makes it so that Godpharaoh's Statue is worse in about 50% of your games because people can just take you off of your treasure generation. Right? It may buy you time, but all your opponent needs to do is bounce this and then potentially win. There's also a lot more Thrasios.
So all the Thrasios player needs to do is make sure that a Biomancer's Familiar or a Seedborn Muse or whatever is in play by resolving one spell. And then you're able to leverage that into more card draw to find the bounce spell and then win the game. So there are also significantly more bounce spells that are being played in general. So Stax is much worse compared to what it was in the past. That's just generically where it is right now, unfortunately. But the other thing is, spells your opponents cast cost 2 more to cast. Mostly affects everyone, but really affects turbo decks. Turbo decks are presenting wins on turns 2 or turn 3. You will not have an activation for Godpharaohs in time, usually. So what that means is that they've already been stopped once and you're making sure they can't win the game after that. And hopefully your other two opponents have few enough resources to where Godpharaohs lets you slowly walk to a win. These type of games are few and far between, at least in my experience and in my meta. And from what I've heard from so many other pilots, they're experiencing very similar things. The other problem is that Godpharaoh statue as a response defensively and not a proactive defensive choice. There are just better answers to the problems that this solves as well. Let's say, as an example, Ral is going to flip, right? You know that they've cast enough spells. You want to make sure that they can't win the game. If you're playing Damping Sphere, that's a good way to do it, right? It's infinitely harder to win through a Damping Sphere as a Storm deck than Godpharaoh statue, because it ramps. You also have Pithing Needle or Disruptor Flute, if you're on those, right? So this can just name the backside or the Planeswalker side of Ral. You don't have to worry about it. This doesn't stop Thrasios decks, really, because all they need to do is resolve one thing. They just need a Seedboard in play or a Biomancer's Familiar. They're going to draw enough stuff and bounce your stuff, right? So there are so many situations where this isn't strong, and then other situations, like let's say you're trying to stop Breach. Well, Grafdigger's Cage stops Breach in its tracks, and Grafdigger's Cage also stops all the green to field tutors, which are requirements for a lot of the win cons in, decks that play green. So there's so much more value that you get from other pieces as a defensive choice. And also, like I talked about earlier, it's really hard to get multiple activations after, your first defensive tutor. So it's more likely that that game is going to go to a draw just by Godpharaohs being in play, if there isn't a bounce spell for it in the next couple turns, than you winning the game. At least in my experience while playing the card. Similarly, Damping Sphere when played from hand has the same problem. But that's neither here nor there. There's still enough turbo decks to where a turn 1 Damping Sphere can be very powerful as far as stopping that. So, Godpharaoh statue, while it has been iconic for our deck forever, we're getting to the point where it's just not good enough, unfortunately. If you like this effect, you can find another cut. But at least as far as what I see for this card and how a lot of the people that I talk to in our community have had experiences with this card or not playing this card, even when it's in their deck as a tutor target or whatever, just makes it so that it feels like the correct decision to take it out again. The first variant we're going to look at is the actual Magdanomicon, which is mid-range. The things that make this mid-range is that it is not on every possible piece of fast mana possible. It's on enough to make sure that its game plan happens while still being able to hold up interaction. But primarily it is just looking to use as much interaction as it can to influence the game while having its main game plan of either get to 5 treasures with an artifact dwarf in play or get to 10 treasures. Whether that's 5 treasures for a roaming throne and then 6 treasures the following turn, or whatever, right? It uses enough quote-unquote Stax pieces or silver bullets to be able to solve any problem that you might have put at you. As an example, Grafdigger's Cage solves Breach, it solves all the green 2-field tutors, it solves graveyard-based recursion, so, Hulk isn't a thing with Grafdigger's Cage, as an example. So if you're playing against like a Tim the Halana or whatever, it shuts down Kinnon's ability, it shuts down Sisay's ability outside of its Planeswalkers. It's a very powerful effect that is almost ubiquitous in the format as to its usefulness. And because we have enough ways to make or generate artifact dwarves now through it, like with Lifecraft Engine, Liquid Metal Torque, and Furdock Core, that the downside of this being in play isn't really there, since it's still a 10 treasure game, which is, kind of where you want to be. Defensively tutoring this is not always where you want to be, but sometimes it's where you have to go, and usually those games either end in a draw, or you natty draw into some way to make extra treasures, like a Xorn or a Roaming Throne or a Gogo or whatever, and can still find your way to win from there. You then have Vexing Bubble, which makes breach lines very difficult. It also makes all of Ral's stuff not work, because you can't cast for free, and it shuts down Atali, which is a relatively popular deck in the format. You have your Damping Sphere to shut off Cradle and, slow down Storm decks. You have your Torpor Orb for stopping ETBs. There are a lot more ETBs in the format, just other than Thoracle. Like, this card shuts off Rocco as a deck, as an example. It shuts off the new Formidable Speaker card. There's so many important things in the format that this turns off. And then outside of like these things, you have graveyard interaction with Unlicensed Hearse. You have Portal of Phyrexia to clear the board. And in some cases, like if your Roaming Throne has been killed, you can get this to get your Roaming Throne back on the next turn, as an example. And yeah, otherwise we have Pithing Needle and Disruptor Flute. Disruptor Flute being able to be used to prevent people from playing Bowmaster or stop their breach line. There's a lot of use cases for Disruptor Flute that, shut down specific things. Like, if people don't have enough mana, Disruptor Fluting on a specific 0 mana rock can turn off their Hullbreaker Horror loop. But some of these things are a little cute, but this having flash speed and also being castable from hand for cheap is very, very important. And then Pithing Needle is just, there are so many decks in the format that win with activated abilities or use activated abilities. You have Thrasios, Aboro Breezecaller, Sisay, Kinnan. It's really funny to jam this on turn 1 into a Turbo Pod and just name Necropotence. But yeah, this is sort of where this deck looks to interact, is push their own wins, and if you're forced to defensively tutor, it's almost always going to be something to stop the win attempt at hand, not ubiquitously like slow down the game or whatever, unless it's a portal that's doing that. Another aspect of midrange is that even though you're on quite the package as far as interaction goes, you have your stack interaction or removal like Pyroblast, Red Blast, your SWAT effects like Redirect Lightning, Deflecting SWAT, Untimely Malfunction, and Return the Favor, but you still are on creature removal like Pyrokinesis, Galvanic Blast, etc. But usually these are to solve the problems that our deck comes across. All of the bounce spells are blue, so Pyroblast, Red Blast.
the SWAT effects also affect those, right? Getting rid of your opposition agents and stuff. But the important difference between Turbo and, Stax variants of the deck is that those decks make it their own problem to deal with faster decks or specific types of things in the early game that you don't necessarily need to be the answer to. Depending on what your meta is, you are not usually forced to be the one to stop other players. Our deck can do that, especially against creature-focused decks, but it's not necessarily where you want to be. Because we're mono-red, you want to be as parasitic as possible and force counterspells and stuff to be used by opponents before you're really using your interaction at all. So that's where mid-range shines, is having a diverse package that can be used either offensively or defensively. And it uses more instants than a Turbo or Stax or Turbo Stax variant of the build might otherwise. So the next variant we're going to look at is Turbo. This is something that basically gets off of all the things that are going to slow down our opponents or our silver bullets to try to get extra speed. So this brings in things like Mox Hammer, Mox Diamond, Grim Monolith, Rite of Flame, Great Train Heist, Guild Artisan. Goes up an Artifact Dwarf, goes up a vehicle to try to get extra consistency, and then tries to use Gamble as a way to get things that may push you to a win, whether that be an Artifact Dwarf or a Roaming Throne or whatever it may be. The important thing about a Turbo variant of the build is that everyone has their own take on it. Some people still play some of the Stax pieces like Grafdigger's Cage and Vexing Bauble and Godpharaoh statue and stuff, but depending on those situations and what the pilot specifically wants, it's not really gaining the up to half turn that a quote-unquote Turbo variant of Magda might have over a mid-range list. And the important thing about Turbo versus mid-range versus, Stax or whatever, is that mid-range and Turbo both have the same game plan as far as trying to get to wins as fast as possible. But there's slightly more consistency for some fast mana, which may give you more explosive hands, which is why you might have 0.25 to 0.5 turns ahead with this sort of a build. It makes turn 3 more consistent by about 15% or so, but it's not high enough to the point where it's worth giving up all the tools available to you that mid-range might generate. There are some players like Rust that are mid-range leaning towards Turbo that are playing things like Rite of Flame and Grim Monolith and stuff just to have some sort of extra consistency, but leaving out other things like extra Artifact Dwarves and Gamble and stuff. Next we have Hard Stax. This is looking to leverage things that slow the game down, or take people off of the ability to cast specific types of spells. So this is things like Trinisphere, Chalice of the Void in the early seats, Thorn of Amethyst, Sphere of Resistance, maintaining playing the Magus and Blood Moon, still playing Godpharaohs. Some pilots are on Zhao, the Moonslayer, like Andrewbot. And non-basic lands entering tap definitely does slow the game down. Makes fetch lands a nightmare for players. But Tanglewire is a card that you'll see in a lot of Hard Stax and Turbo Stax lists. My experience with this card is that it is so polarizing. There are too many times where in response to the trigger, a Bowmaster comes in, or a Swords to Plowshares goes off, or Magda is bounced, and the value from my Tangle Wire just doesn't exist. So it might just be bad luck. Some players love this card, but as our card quality has gone up over time and we've gotten extra things that we want, it's really only the hard stacks players that continue to play this, and some turbo stacks lists. Notably, Mishra's Workshop is usually played in this type of list, since all of your stacks effects outside of Magus of the Moon are usually artifacts. The most important aspect of playing stacks is understanding when to put out specific things and how they interact with specific matchups. So hard stacks is probably the hardest variant of Magda to pilot well. And understanding when to tutor for things to layer your stacks package and when to try to push for wins instead takes a lot of time and format understanding. Lastly, we have turbo stacks. This is using fast mana like Grim Monolith, Rite of Flame, Mox Diamond to increase the consistency of both your Magda-based game plan of getting to a win potentially on turn 3, or leveraging early fast mana to help you deploy layered stacks like Tangle Wire, Sphere of Resistance, Godfarah Statue, Trinisphere, Magus effects, etc. And just like hard stacks, usually they're on things like Mishra's Workshop to help with that facilitation. Most decks are still playing things like Vexing Bauble, but for this example, I was having personally a hard time finding a cut for the things that are new and powerful, that are staples for the deck at this point. But yeah, it really depends on the pilot and what they're playing, but it is basically just trying to go as fast as it can in one direction or the other, either staxing the game out or trying to win the game as fast as possible. This is the second most popular variant of the deck and is usually the most popular when you're in Turbo Hell, where you're seeing more than one turbo deck in the pod.
The first card to talk about is Magda the Hoardmaster. Whenever you commit a crime, create a tapped treasure token. This ability triggers only once each turn. So the fact that this only happens once each turn sucks. But it is something that you can leverage to your advantage to help make extra treasures throughout the turn cycle. Things like Xorn also help with this, because you'll make an extra treasure, whereas things like Roaming Throne do not, as you'll have 2 triggers and you're only allowed to have 1 resolve. Now that being said, most of our 1-drop dwarves have some sort of ability to target. Bloodfire Dwarf does not, because it is a blanket statement. Dwarven Armorer does, because you can target your own creatures or an opponent's. Dwarven Scorcher allows you to target any creature, and regardless of if they allow you to do the damage or take 2 damage, you will still trigger the crime. Enslaved Dwarf allows you to target black creatures. Liberated Dwarf allows you to target green creatures. And then Spark Mage has a target ability when it deals damage to an opponent. Usually for this to do its best, you have to sort of let people keep their dorks if they offer to trade. But there are certain situations where if you're playing as a Kinnan or something where they will take the damage, but you can still target Kinnan for 1 damage to make a treasure with Magda the Hoardmaster. Axguard Cavalry is another way that you can target an opponent's thing. The most important one is Dwarven Bloodboiler, because it allows you to tap an untapped dwarf you control and then target creature, one that your opponent controls, allows you to basically double dip and get 2 treasures per turn, meaning per turn cycle up to 8 depending on your board state, but with just Magda, Blood Boiler, and our commander, that is 6 treasures per turn cycle, which is substantial. Plundering Barbarian also can commit a crime by targeting an artifact that your opponent controls. So you still get the extra treasure, making this not necessarily a modal thing, but something that you get both of, right? Both options. Also, you have your interaction suite, obviously, as far as things that can target. And there are things like Liquid Metal Torque that can also target opponent things as well. Or unlicensed hearse targeting their graveyard, etc. So there's quite a few things in the deck that actually have huge impacts with Magda the Hoardmaster, and this is a very powerful card in the deck. Another card to discuss is Chaos Warp. We don't have a whole lot of answers to things like Food Chain, outside of using something like a Liquid Metal Torque to enable a shatter effect, like an Untimely Malfunction, or a Zoyoa's Justice or something, to disperse of it. So Chaos Warp is very powerful, being able to, get rid of Rhystic Studies, get rid of Smothering Ties, mostly enchantment-based things. But it is ubiquitous removal, including for lands, so you can get rid of a Cradle as well if an opponent is trying to, win with a Boros Breezecaller or something. In response to them casting the Breezecaller or the thing that you know is going to get it, you can also use Chaos Warp to remove the Cradle. So it does have a lot of value, but it is a high CMC interaction. So even though it is used for a potential combo with Pinnacle Monk, it is not 100% required to be in the deck. It's just there for consistency, being able to have answers to things that you might not have answers to otherwise, while also being a catalyst to, if you've already played your Pinnacle Monk as a Mystic Peak, it will put it back in your deck as the creature. So in situations where you don't have access to Roaming Throne or Barkform Harvester, this may be important, as Pinnacle Monk is basically the only other way to win at instant speed at that point, at least in the current iteration of the deck. Next we have Twin Shot Sniper. Twin Shot Sniper is a very, very powerful card in our deck, mostly because it allows us to compartmentalize a lot of win conditions with it, while also being a pseudo-uncounterable piece of removal for things that we care about, like Opposition Agent. There is an entire podcast episode from That's a Good Card going over this a little bit in depth, but this deck in particular leverages all the upsides of Twin Shot Sniper better than basically any other deck in the format. The next card we have is Vexing Bubble. This is just a ubiquitously strong card in the current meta. It slows down people's 0-mana rocks, makes it so that people can't play ROG, and it is a draw loop for us with Barkform Harvester. So if you're in a situation where you, for some reason, need to draw loop, which is no longer really necessary for our win conditions, it's still something that you can do. It shuts down decks like Atali, it shuts down things like Ral. It's a very powerful tool. But an underrated aspect of this card is, if you draw one of your major win conditions, like Clock of Omens or Maskwood Nexus or whatever, this is a good way that you can allow yourself a much higher chance for these cards to resolve. So being able to tutor Vexing Bubble and then cast your Clock of Omens is another route that is available to you, where you're not just risking your Clock of Omens going to the graveyard, where then you might need an extra tutor, because you'll have to go get your Barkform Harvester and then put it back in your deck and tutor again. So this pulls like triple duty in a way. The next card I want to talk about is the One Ring. This is a card that I do not run personally, so this is a flex slot for the deck. If you do not value the upsides this card gives you, you can remove it and add consistency in some other way. You can add another Stax piece, you can add more interaction, you can add another dwarf, you can add whatever you want, right? But there's not something that I'm comfortable suggesting that everyone adds to the deck, which is kind of why the card is still here to begin with. So before we talk about the downsides of this card, let's talk about the upsides. There are a lot more decks that are seeing play in the meta at the moment, or at least there's a slight resurgence in them, that are control decks that do not use Breach as a win con and do not use green. So this is primarily things like Shurikai or Esper piles like Marnius or Tibet that play Grafdigger's Cage. So having a way to fight through an opponent's Grafdigger's Cage at instant speed is something that is not irrelevant, right? The One Ring alongside Clock of Omens allows you to use all of your artifacts in your deck to draw loop until you hit a shatter effect, like Untimely, Zoyoa's, Chaos Warp, or a Braid, so that you can remove your opponent's Grafdigger's Cage. And then obviously you can draw extra if you don't have anything in your hand, so that you can have access to a SWAT effect, like Deflecting SWAT or Redirect Lightning or whatever. And then your Pyroblast and Red Blast on top of that to help deal with counterspells, Tibalt Trickery, whatever. We have quite a few things that generate red mana as well, so you would not necessarily use these for your clock immediately, like a Relic of Legends, Mox Opal, Lotus Petal, etc. Also, if you have an untapped creature still on your board, which you should from your clock combo, you can get Lifecraft Engine and then all of the rest of your vehicles and be able to produce treasures that are untapped by tapping the vehicles and crewing one another, right? So you'll have plenty of red mana available alongside also your artifact lands in Treasure Vault and Great Furnace. This is also relevant on our own turns because the One Ring can draw us cards and then we can just simply play them from our hand. The only time this is a problem is if there's a Bowmaster, but if you're doing things at instant speed, the Bowmaster doesn't matter that it's there. Its pings will never resolve. So that is the biggest upside to this. And the fact that it can draw you cards if it is played early enough. You know, if you play this turn 2, then you're potentially drawing, you know, upwards of 7 cards in a game depending on how long it lasts. But as the meta has become a little bit more refreshed, I want to say, as far as the consistency that you're seeing a variety of decks, be it turbo, mid-range, whatever, as more and more turbo decks come back or are seeing more play to try to get under the mid-range decks, this is just too slow in most of those cases. But in purely mid-range games, it can get you the card draw that you want in some cases. So now let's talk about the downsides. The first downside is the actual amount of card draw that you get. If you play on curve, turn 1 Dwarf, turn 2 Magda, turn 3 X, if that turn 3 is the One Ring, then you're drawing 1 card on turn 3, 2 cards on turn 4, and then 3 cards on turn 5. If you don't get past turn 4, you're never seeing the 6 cards total, and realistically, from that board state, you are almost never winning that game. Having access to, you know, 1 Tutor, if you haven't drawn an artifact dwarf with the One Ring in the first 3 cards, that 1 Tutor is not going to win you the game, right? If you have a defensive Tutor there, then the more cards that you draw, the more dangerous that you are, and the more likely that someone is going to just Tutor for the Bowmaster, right? Once Bowmaster is in play, unless you specifically made deals with people to not touch your stuff, the One Ring is essentially a 4-mana do-nothing. And there are so many decks in the format that play this card. So a vast majority of the games that you will experience, it gives them an extra reason to Tutor Bowmaster that they didn't have before. Yes, Bowmaster might stop you from being able to win, But now with the One Ring in play, you've put yourself in a position where if you're drawing 2 or 3 cards with it, you're essentially potentially blowing yourself out of the game. So there are some severe downsides to this card as far as how it ends up getting played in the current meta. The other issue with this is that a lot of decks have gone off the One Ring. So you'll see a lot less Kinnons playing it, etc., right? But it is very powerful. So all these decks usually are playing Phyrexian Metamorph, or at least, or extra things that will allow them to copy the One Ring. Giving opponents that are not on the One Ring access to it, especially if they might have a way to untap it, like a Seedborn Muse or something, is not necessarily what you want to be doing, right? That's going to come up a lot less than the Bowmaster stuff, but just not having quite enough card draw in most situations, unless it comes down on turn 1, in which case you are already playing a turn behind in a way and hoping that the card draw that you have and the fast mana that you kept in your opening hand gets you there, may or may not work out for you, right? So the card is pretty volatile, and a lot of the volatility has to do with opponent's decision making rather than your own, which makes it quite a bit worse than you might hope for.
I've already talked about how Legion Extruder ended up getting in the deck in one of the previous sections, but I do want to reiterate some of its strengths. Legion Extruder is very powerful in conjunction with Grafdigger's Cage. With Cage in play, as it is the most powerful Stax piece in our deck, and in the format at the moment, in my opinion, Legion Extruder allows you to deal 2 damage to any target when it is tutored. This is not something that comes up super often, but there are plenty of combo pieces or cards that are integral to like particular game plans for a deck that are 2 toughness or less. So Legion Extruder can help deal with those problems. Legion Extruder also gives you an instant speed way to remove our own Grafdigger's Cage. This way of removing our own Grafdigger's Cage or sacrificing any other artifact technically gives us a 3/3 colorless Golem artifact creature token as well. So this is a win condition that you can make infinite of these and then go to combat and kill someone. Or the new card that just got added, Stalactite Dagger, gives all creature types to the equipped creature, making the Golem into an artifact dwarf. So this turns the game into a single activation win potential in some cases. It's also kind of cute to be able to get a 3/3 Golem instead of taking 1 damage from your Mana Vault every turn. There's just a lot of incidental upsides, and all of these small things amount to the card being worth playing, in my opinion. If this is not an effect that you are looking to have, if you would rather keep the One Ring for the Grafdigger's Cage stuff and you're confident in just one avenue for removing Cage, whether it's your own or your opponent's, then this is something that you may look to remove, but I highly suggest playing it, and most pilots that have gone onto it have found it to be very useful.
So the first combo we're going to talk about is Clock of Omens. It's a very basic combo. Clock of Omens' ability reads, tap 2 untapped artifacts you control, untap target artifact. So if you have an artifact dwarf, such as Universal Automaton, you would tap the dwarf and the clock, or the dwarf and any other artifact, to start the loop. You'll be targeting your artifact dwarf with the Clock of Omens activation. When you tap the dwarf as part of the activation cost, it will make a treasure. And then once everything is resolved, your dwarf will be untapped. You can then use the dwarf and the treasure to generate another treasure, leaving one tapped, generating a new one, and then untapping your dwarf. Then you can continue this over and over and over again using the freshly made untapped treasure and the dwarf to go for infinite tapped treasures. You can then transition into infinite untapped treasures. This is done either with Roaming Throne, as Roaming Throne doubles Magda's triggers, giving you 2 treasures every iteration, meaning that you're left over with 1 extra treasure every time that you do the Clock of Omens loop. You also alternatively have Maskwood Nexus alongside Xorn. Xorn is a replacement effect, so every time that you make 1 treasure, you'll instead make 2. So Maskwood Nexus and Xorn is the equivalent of Roaming Throne, essentially. And then thirdly, if you don't have access to the 3 of these things, you can use Battered Golem. Battered Golem has a triggered ability that whenever an artifact comes into play, you may untap Battered Golem. So, when you use Battered Golem and your Dwarf for the activation of Clock of Omens to untap your Dwarf, you'll make a treasure. The treasure will then trigger Battered Golem, untapping it, and then the resolution of Clock of Omens will happen, untapping your Artifact Dwarf. And then you can then repeat this process infinitely to make infinite untapped treasures. An important aspect of this, though, is that there are other artifact dwarves or ways to make artifact dwarves, right? You have Liquid Metal Torque targeting any of your dwarves, such as Magda, or you have Lifecraft Engine, or any other vehicle such as Clown Car with Lifecraft Engine in play, and obviously have named Dwarf after it has been crewed and becomes a creature. The same thing works with Maskwood Nexus and all other vehicles. So there's a lot of different ways that you can go about things. Roaming Throne is usually one of the main ways that this happens, because you'll have a board state like Magda, another dwarf, and a clown car. You'll have gotten to 5 treasures, and then you'll be able to tutor for Roaming Throne, right? So at this point, you'll have Roaming Throne untapped, 2 other untapped dwarves, one including Magda, and your tapper. This might seem problematic because, well, you need the ability to tap Roaming Throne with the Clock of Omens, but if you need to get to 5 treasures, you need to tap the Roaming Throne, your other dwarf, and Magda to generate 6 treasures. Now, this isn't a problem at all, because you'll use 5 of these treasures going down to 1 to get Clock of Omens. You will then use Clock of Omens and your vehicle to untap your Roaming Throne. Then you can use Roaming Throne and the treasure to transition from there. Alternatively, you can just leave your vehicle untapped, use the treasure and Clock of Omens to untap Roaming Throne, and then crew Roaming Throne to make 2 more treasures. You can then use those 2 treasures to untap Roaming Throne, and repeat the process over and over again, making infinite tapped treasures. And then you can transition at any point, either by using the vehicle, or by tutoring another copy of Roaming Throne via Sculpting Steel to go from there. The first combo to make infinite treasures without clock is pretty simple. Assemble a tap outlet, Maskwood Nexus, which turns all your creatures into dwarves, and then Battered Golem. Battered Golem reads whenever an artifact comes into play, you may untap Battered Golem. So you crew Battered Golem into your vehicle. This makes a treasure, which untaps your Battered Golem, and you repeat the process over and over again. This is a very resilient combo, because for every other creature that you have on the board, or vehicle that has already been successfully crewed beforehand, you can go over the top. So you tap your Battered Golem to trigger Magda. Your opponent interacts trying to sword your Battered Golem. Cool. Tap your Magda, put another trigger on the stack. Oh, they're trying to do it again. Well, your Clown car has already been crewed by something else to make the treasures to tutor your Maskwood Nexus for this. So you crew your Clown car into another vehicle. This puts another trigger on the stack. Well, that doesn't resolve. Crap. Well, now we have Maskwood Nexus's ability if you have 3 mana available. So you would make a 2/2 blue shapeshifter creature token with Changeling, and then crew that into your vehicle. So it makes it very difficult for your opponents to just have the nuts to stop you, at least in a lot of board states. So This is one of the more resilient combos as far as um, winning without Clock of Omens, or at least putting yourself in a position to combo off with infinite untapped treasures without Clock of Omens. The ladder line using Xorn to win without Clock of Omens is very simple. You start with 5 treasures, Xorn, and a dwarf that is untapped, along with a vehicle. From here, it's very simple. Use your treasures, grab Roaming Throne, enter named dwarf. Now each time that Magda is tapped, or any dwarf is tapped I should say, you'll make 4 treasures. So you'll tap your Magda here and your Roaming Throne to generate 8 treasures. From here, you'll use 5, going down to 3, in order to get Sculpting Steel. This will be a copy of Roaming Throne. Now every time that you tap a dwarf, you will make 6. Tap. Go to 9. From here, you'll use 5, going down to 4. Get Maskwood Nexus. Then you tap Xorn, make another 6, going to 10, and then you can do a bunch of things. You can get Battered Golem, and then try to go off, and if they stop you, you have an extra tutor for another creature. Or you can go with the slightly safer route, I guess, of getting every other dwarf in your deck, going +1 treasure each time, and then you have the most efficient way to do it, which is Barkform Harvester, Plundering Barbarian, and Twin Shot Sniper. So let's start by tutoring Barkform. We're at 10, we'll go down to 5. We'll tap Barkform, go to 11. From here, we will tutor Plundering Barbarian. Plundering a Barbarian will get 3 ETBs. Each one you'll choose Pry and Open. This creates a treasure token. That will have a replacement effect with Xorn. So you'll make 6 treasures. You will tap Plundering Barbarian to crew, making another 6 treasures. You will then grab Twin Shot Sniper, going down 5, putting you at 18. You'll get 3 ETBs because Maskwood Nexus and the 2 Roaming Thrones. You'll hold priority on the ETBs. But the ETBs will have 2 target Twin Shot Sniper and 1 target Plundering Barbarian. In response to those, you'll tap, make another 6 treasures. This will kill Twin Shot Sniper, and it will also kill Plundering Barbarian. From here, you will use Barkform Harvester's ability, using 2 treasures and then another 5, so 7 total. This will put us at 17 in order to get Plundering Barbarian back into play, making a total of 12 again. So these 2 creatures generate 18 treasures, and it costs you 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 for each time that they go into the graveyard and come back out. Then, once you have infinite treasures, you can transition to just winning with only Twin Shot Sniper, having 2 of Twin Shot Sniper's abilities hit itself, 1 hitting an opponent, and then repeating the process over and over and over again. The line for Roaming Throne requires a slightly more robust board state. 2 dwarves, Roaming Throne, and an activation. All of them need to be untapped. Or just 3 dwarves with a tapped Roaming Throne. Whatever, right? Just 3 untapped dwarves to start. So you will start by activating Magda, going and getting Sculpting Steel as a copy of Roaming Throne. You'll then tap the 4 dwarves available to generate 12 treasures, because you will have 3 triggers each 4 times, putting you at 12. You'll then go to 2, double activate, you will get Maskwood Nexus, and then you will get Xorn. From here, tap Xorn, make 6, And then you go right into the Plundering Barbarian stuff. So you go down to 3, grab a Barkform Harvester, tap it, go to 9. Grab Plundering Barbarian, going down to 4, 3 ETBs from the 2 Roaming Thrones. Each one will generate 2 treasures because of Xorn. So this will be 6 treasures going up to 10. Tap it, make another 6, go to 16. Use 5. Go down to 11. Grab Twin Shot Sniper. 3 ETBs because of Maskwood and the 2 Roaming Thrones. Twin Shot Sniper targets itself twice, targets Plundering Barbarian once. Hold priority, tap it in response, make 6 more treasures. Both of them go to the graveyard. Spend 4, going down to 13, to put them back in your deck. Spend 5, going down to 8, to grab Plundering Barbarian again. 3 ETBs and the tap go up 12, putting you at 20. Go down to 15. Twin Shot, 3 ETBs, double Twin Shot, Plundering, hold priority, tap, go up to 21. Both of them die. So, Twin Shot Sniper and Plundering Barbarian together are 18 treasures. The 2 taps, which are 12, and the 3 ETBs from Plundering, which is another 6. Putting them into play costs 10. Putting them back in your deck costs 4. So this is a +4 for each iteration. And then you will continue making infinite treasures, and then you can just loop Twin Shot Sniper by itself to kill the table. So, the ladder line starting with Gogo is very simple. You start with either 2 dwarves, Gogo, Clown Car, or any vehicle and 0 treasures, or you start with Magda, Gogo, and 2 treasures instead. So you go to combat. Gogo becomes a copy of Magda. From this point, you will get 2 triggers every time that a dwarf is tapped, so you tap all 3. Make 6 treasures. Go to 6. Activate, go down to 1. Grab Roaming Throne, name dwarf. Tap it, make 4, 2 times for Gogo, 2 times for Magda, go up to 5. Go down to 0. Grab Sculpting Steel. Enter as a copy of Roaming Throne, name dwarf. Tap, make 6. From here, go down to 1. Grab Lifecraft Engine. Lifecraft Engine makes your first vehicle into a dwarf. Tap to crew Lifecraft Engine. Make 6 treasures. Tap Lifecraft Engine. You're going to go to 13 total. Go down to 3. Grab Maskwood Nexus. Grab Xorn. Tap Xorn, make 12. Go to 15. From here, go down to 10. Grab Barkform Harvester. Tap it, go up 12, go to 22. Go down to 17. Tutor Twin Shot Sniper. ETB, 2 target itself, 1 target an opponent, hold priority, crew, make 12 treasures. Go to 29. So, because Lifecraft Engine gives +1/+1 to all dwarves, Maskwood Nexus gives Twin Shot Sniper dwarf, so 2 will deal damage to Twin Shot Sniper, killing it, putting it to the graveyard. From here, it will cost you 7 total to put it back in your deck and tutor it back out, but it will generate 12 every time that it is crewed. So each time that you do this, where you have 3 ETBs, you will target 2 for itself, target 1 at an opponent, hold priority, crew it, make 12. So you are +5 for every iteration, and you're killing your opponents in the process.
There is another cute thing that you can do with Maskwood Nexus and Magda the Hoardmaster. Once Maskwood Nexus is in play, you can tutor Magda the Hoardmaster, and then as long as it is your turn, you can activate Magda the Hoardmaster to make a Scorpion Dragon. From here you can tap the Scorpion Dragon to crew a vehicle and make an untapped treasure. And then you can make infinite Scorpion Dragons. This is only relevant if this is main phase 2, as you would have needed to make the treasures to go infinite with clock in combat. And then you can transition into whatever you want. This is also only relevant if you don't have access to Battered Golem, Roaming Throne, or Xorn. So it's very niche, but every so often it does come up.
Winning with Clock of Omens through Grafdigger's Cage is very difficult because you don't have the ability to tutor your Roaming Throne or tutor your Universal Automaton or whatever. So unless you play one of these things from hand and then have to tutor Clock, then, you know, it's not a big deal. Clock is an artifact, right? But if you have Clock or you have 10 treasures, you need a way to be able to get Clock and an artifact dwarf. So, assuming you have Clock in play, and your Grafdigger's Cage, you have 3 different options in the deck currently. Liquimetal Torque, Furdock Core, Lifecraft Engine. Lifecraft Engine being a vehicle, if you don't already have a vehicle, solves that problem, as long as you have an untapped dwarf, right? So, if you have an untapped dwarf, you can grab Lifecraft Engine. Tap it, crew it, becomes a artifact dwarf, and then you can use the Clock of Omens thing to make infinite tapped treasures. Alternatively, if you have a tapped Magda, you can just grab Furdock Core, or, you know, no untapped dwarfs. Grab Furdock Core, do the thing. If you do have an untapped dwarf, you can also grab Liquimetal Torque, use Liquimetal Torque to target the dwarf, and then use the dwarf and Clock of Omens to do the thing. Now, there are 2 ways that you can move forward from this. One of them is with Legion Extruder. Once you have infinite tapped treasures, you can then go get any sort of mana rock like Soul Ring or Mana Vault or whatever to get access to Legion Extruder's activated ability so that you can get rid of your cage. And then you have infinite activations. You can go get your Roaming Throne, your Xorn plus Maskwood Nexus, whatever it is that you need to transition to infinite untapped treasures. This is the safest way to go about it. But if you don't have access to Legion Extruder, for whatever reason, you can use the One Ring. So you're going to want to tutor out all of your mana rocks, all of everything relevant, all your vehicles, etc. And then you're going to use the One Ring alongside Clock of Omens and your suite of artifacts to draw cards. So you will tap the One Ring, draw a card. Use Clock of Omens to untap it. Do it again. Untap it. You want to make sure that you have left access to red mana so that you can use a Shatter spell. Untimely Malfunction, Abrade, Chaos Warp, Soyoa's Justice, etc. for Grafdigger's Cage. You then have to dodge Roaming Throne, Xorn, and Battered Golem, all being in hand before you get your Shatters. Obviously, you can also draw for protection, so that you have like Red Blast, Pyroblast, etc. But as long as Maskwood is in play, and you do have access to Xorn or Battered Golem or whatever, there is no issue whatsoever transitioning into infinite treasures afterward. it's a very small chance, it's like a 2% chance or whatever, for you to actually brick. This is important if your opponent has a Grafdigger's Cage, as it's the only way to actually win at instant speed through their Grafdigger's Cage. However, that's not entirely relevant, because you can Stax out the board, force your opponents to have an empty board with Portal to Phyrexia, copying Portal's trigger with Peter Parker's camera multiple times, so that they have no board. You have, Torpor Orb and Damping Sphere and a bunch of other things in play that are stopping them. Disruptor Flute naming Thrasios or Sisay or whatever is in the pod, and basically just making it so that it's very difficult for them to win. You'll always want to leave Sculpting Steel in your deck in that case, if you are trying to force another turn, so that if they attempt to bounce whatever it is that you are controlling their particular deck with, that you can always make an extra copy of it. Right? And in that case, you would want Cage in play anyway, because stopping breach at instant speed, etc., etc. But once you have, your next turn, you can use the One Ring to draw your deck and then play things from your deck to be able to win, and eventually, remove your own cage or your opponent's cage or whatever. So it's pretty trivial to win through Grafdigger's Cage, because we now have access to Lifecraft Engine and Furdock Core, but even in the past we had Liquid Metal Torque and a couple other things, so it's not that big of a deal. Just sometimes getting to the 10 treasures you might need may be a little bit daunting, which is why the consistency for artifact dwarfs in the deck is also very important. ETB enters tapped is not a very common effect. It's primarily seen in the format on Blind Obedience, which is a win condition, or a Stax Beast in specific decks, or Spider Woman, because Spider Woman is seen very commonly in Sisay. It slows down their opponents, which is what is very helpful for them, while also giving them 2 colors for Sisay. Next down the list, you have Dauntless Dismantler. The pay 0 and a white to sacrifice it is really annoying, because this can be done without Summoning Sickness, because it doesn't require a tap. So you can end up getting screwed by this card pretty easily. Root Maze is not super common, but it is in some decks. Some Yi-Sans run this, but it's not very common at all. Manglehorn is seen in some mono green decks. It was seen in Kinnan for a while, but it's not that important now. It does also screw you by being able to blow up your clock or your dwarf or whatever, so this was an annoying card to deal with. But we had Spine of Isha to solve all these problems at one point. Now it would be Meteor Sword for some lists. But we're no longer playing this sort of effect. It's a pseudo-dead card, doesn't do anything other than when you are trying to pull off something defensive. So in this case, you would need access to either tutoring a dwarf or tutoring Clock of Omens alongside Spine, with Spine being the first thing that you tutor. That's not really necessary. Manglehorn and Spider Woman specifically, we have 2 answers for that do not require winning through them. This is Legion Extruder and Twin Shot Sniper. They both have 2 toughness, so these will dispatch of them with their ETBs. Going through Blind Obedience, Root Maze, and Dauntless Dismantler is a bit harder. So in order to do this, you need a board state that has an untapped Artifact Dwarf, Clock of Omens, and an activation. Your activation will get you Battered Golem. Battered Golem will enter, tapped, but it will see itself enter and untap itself. This is exactly like Grinding Station. You can then use Battered Golem and your Artifact Dwarf to make a treasure, which will enter tapped, which will untap your Battered Golem. Your clock will resolve untapping your dwarf, and you will continue this until you have infinite tapped treasures. Then from here, you can grab Maskwood Nexus, and you can grab Sculpting Steel as a copy of the Golem. From here, you can use the 2 Golems to untap a treasure, making 2 more treasures, untapping your Golems, and repeat the process until you have infinite untapped treasures. And then you can win the game however you want. So Maskwood Nexus is not required for this particular type of line. It makes it so much simpler, but it's not required. In this case, you're going to want Clock of Omens, an untapped Artifact Dwarf, and then Battered Golem. So Tutor, grab Battered Golem, it'll untap itself. Do the same thing, make infinite tapped treasures by using Battered Golem and your Artifact Dwarf for Clock of Omens, targeting your Artifact Dwarf. Tap treasure enters, untaps, untaps, repeat the process. Now grab Sculpting Steel as a copy of Battered Golem. Now grab Roaming Throne. So there's 2 choices that you have. You can either name Golem, which will affect Battered Golem, or you can name Dwarf. In this case, we're going to name Dwarf for the first iteration. This will make it so that Magda will have 2 triggers every time a treasure generation happens. So you'll start again. Battered Golem with Universal Automaton. This will get 2 Magda triggers. First Magda trigger happens, untaps Battered Golem. Hold priority on the second one, use both Battered Golems to untap a treasure. Resolve the second Magda trigger, untap both Battered Golems, resolve your Clock of Omens, repeat this loop over and over again. Now, if you name Golem, you will get 2 untaps for every iteration of the Magda trigger. So you would have 2 untaps of both of these on the stack. The first untap would happen, which would only affect Battered Golem number 1. You would then use both of them to untap a treasure, and then the second Battered Golem trigger would happen, or be resolved, untapping both of these, and then you would repeat the process. But what if you don't have access to Roaming Throne? Well, from here, you would go and grab another Artifact Dwarf. This would enter untapped, or tapped, I should say. From this point, you would use both Battered Golems to untap the other Artifact Dwarf. Then you'll use both Artifact Dwarves to untap the first Artifact Dwarf. This will have 2 triggers for both of your Battered Golems. Your Battered Golem first trigger will untap, and you will untap the second Artifact Dwarf. The second one will untap, and then you will tap both of them for Clock of Omens to untap a treasure. This will leave you with an untapped Universal and an untapped Barkform in this case. The Clock of Omens will resolve, untapping your Universal. And then you do it again, using both of these targeting Universal. 2 treasure triggers. First one happens, untap, tap to untap a treasure. Second one happens, untap, tap to untap the other Artifact Dwarf, resolve Clock, repeat. Very simple. So we do have 3 main ways that we can win, but it does require access to Battered Golem and a extra copy via Sculpting Steel, or if your variant of the deck is running it, you can use Cursed Mirror, which also has some other funky things like just doing the same thing as normal, but except you have 2 other copies of Battered Golem that can untap a treasure every turn cycle, or every time that you do it, while just using the Battered Golem and the Universal for the untaps. So it's very simple, and there's a lot of ways around it, and hopefully that is enough to get you to be able to play through these effects without Spine of Isha. The next situation that you might run into is, what if there's a Collector Oof, or a Null Rod, or a Stony Silence, or a Karn the Great Creator, where you no longer have the ability to activate artifacts?
You cannot crew. You cannot use Clock of Omens. This is where it is important that you might have another tap outlet, such as Caveron, which is sorcery speed but still a way to win, or Dwarven Bloodboiler. So, if either of these are in play, it's pretty easy to be able to win. You just use the Maskwood Nexus and Battered Golem line along with either of these things, right? In order to put this together, costs 15 treasures. If you have Caveron, it costs 10. So if you do manage to have, an Artifact Dwarf and Clock of Omens and stuff, you can kill Collector Oof with either Legion Extruder or Twin Shot Sniper to enable that. So that means if you have one of these two things and 10 treasures, you can also win the game that way. But those are primarily the two ways that we can deal with it, because we don't have a way to get rid of Karn the Great Creator or Stony Silence efficiently. If you do draw into something like in a Braid or whatever, obviously you can use it on the Null Rod, right? But being able to play through it most commonly is going to require the Battered Golem line, which is a boon for us that Caveron was printed because it reduces the amount of tutors that you may need from 3 down to 2. There are a few lines to win with Barkform Harvester. The first one we're going to talk about is using ETB effects to kill our opponents. So, Twin Shot Sniper is an option if Torpor Orb is not in play. And if Torpor Orb is in play, then you have Legion Extruder. Legion Extruder also works if you do not have access to Roaming Throne. But if you've already used Roaming Throne for stuff, you can use Twin Shot Sniper as long as you have access to Maskwood Nexus. So, let's get into it. First, we're going to talk about the Legion Extruder variant. Tutor Legion Extruder. ETB deal 2 damage to an opponent. Tutor Sculpting Steel. Enter as a copy of Legion Extruder. Deal 2 damage to an opponent. Use the original Legion Extruder to get rid of the copy. Putting it to the graveyard, making a 3/3 Golem. That's irrelevant. Use Barkform Harvester to put Sculpting Steel back in your deck. Tutor it back out. Have it enter as a copy of Legion Extruder again. Deal 2 damage to an opponent. Use the Sculpting Steel copy to put the original Legion Extruder into the graveyard. Use Barkform to put it back in your deck. Tutor it back out. Deal 2 damage to an opponent. Get rid of the Sculpting Steel copy. And then repeat this process over and over again, tutoring the Sculpting Steel copy, dealing 2 damage, removing the original, etc., etc. And then next we have the Twin Shot Sniper variant. So, you have Roaming Throne. In this case, we're going to have Maskwood Nexus. And then you have Sculpting Steel as a copy of Roaming Throne. Then you tutor Twin Shot Sniper. This will give it 3 ETBs. 2 of them will be pointed at Twin Shot Sniper, 1 of them will be pointed at an opponent. Twin Shot Sniper will die. Opponents will take damage. Barkform Harvester puts Twin Shot Sniper back in your deck. Tutor it back out. Kill itself, deal 2 damage to an opponent, repeat the process until your opponents are dead. So, what happens if you don't have access to Maskwood Nexus or Legion Extruder? Is it still possible to win? And the answer is yes. So, if Roaming Throne has been used to make infinite untapped treasures and stuff, it's already on Dwarf. So that's a problem for Twin Shot Sniper as it's a Goblin Archer. So, you'll start by getting Sculpting Steel, enter as a copy of Roaming Throne, name Goblin. Then you will grab your One Ring. You will draw your deck with the One Ring until you hit a Shatter effect, like a Braid, or Untimely Malfunction, or Chaos Warp, or whatever. And then you will use that on Roaming Throne. Roaming Throne will either get shuffled back into your deck via Chaos Warp or Zoyoa's Justice, or will be removed with a Shatter effect. Put it back in your deck with Barkform Harvester, tutor it back out, name Goblin. Now, if you've drawn Twin Shot Sniper, you can just channel it, put it into the graveyard, and then start your loop. And if not, then you can tutor it out. You will have the 3 ETBs you need in order to win the game. So, winning with Barkform Harvester when you don't have access to Roaming Throne or Legion Extruder somehow is pretty simple. You're relying on a damage effect like Twin Shot Sniper's channel ability, or a bolt effect like Lightning Bolt or Galvanic Blast or whatever that you can recur. The easiest and most simple way is using Vexing Bauble. Vexing Bauble has pay 1, tap it, sack it, draw a card. So you'll do this until your entire library is empty, and then you'll put it back in your library. Then you will either cast Lightning Bolt or channel Twin Shot Sniper out of the opponent, putting it in your graveyard. You will then put both of them back in your library, tutor back out Vexing Bauble, crack it to draw a card, drawing your Twin Shot Sniper or your Bolt effect, and then repeating that process over and over and over again. The next most common way is using Maskwood, Nexus, and Professional Facebreaker. Professional Facebreaker has an ability where you can pay 1 to exile the top card of your library, and you may play it at any time this turn. So, you need Maskwood Nexus to put Professional Facebreaker into play, and then you can use its ability to exile your entire deck. Twin Shot Sniper is not a viable choice here, because the channel ability is not able to be done from exile. You cannot discard it from exile, it needs to be from hand. So you are reliant on Lightning Bolt type effects. The third option is the One Ring and Sculpting Steel. The One Ring is legendary, so you tutor the One Ring, draw a card, tutor Sculpting Steel, enter as the One Ring. Put the One Ring back in your graveyard. Draw a card. Use Barkform Harvester to put the One Ring back in your deck. Tutor it back out. Legend Rule. Sculpting Steel goes to the bin. Draw a card. And then you repeat the process until you have an empty library, with an untapped way of drawing a card. So, from here, Twin Shot Sniper your opponent. Put it in your deck, or in your graveyard. Put it back in your deck with Barkform Harvester. Draw a card. Do it again. Put Twin Shot Sniper and Sculpting Steel back in your deck. Tutor out Sculpting Steel. Original One Ring goes into the graveyard. Draw a card. Twin Shot Sniper your opponent. Put both of them back in your deck. Tutor the One Ring. Legend Rule. Draw a card. Twin Shot Sniper an opponent. Into the graveyard. Both go back into your deck. Tutor out Sculpting Steel. Repeat the process until your opponents are dead. The last combo is also very simple. It uses Barkform Harvester, Legion Extruder, Twin Shot Sniper's ETB, and then Clock of Omens to reset Legion Extruder. So, ETB, Twin Shot Sniper, deal 2 damage to an opponent. Legion Extruder, ETB, deal 2 damage to opponent. Activate, destroy Twin Shot Sniper, put it to the graveyard. Barkform Harvester, put Twin Shot Sniper back in your deck. Tutor Twin Shot Sniper, deal 2 damage to an opponent. Use Clock of Omens to untap Legion Extruder. Tap Legion Extruder targeting Twin Shot Sniper. Put it in your graveyard, Barkform Harvester, back in deck, tutor it back out, clock your Legion, put your Twin Shot Sniper back to the graveyard, repeat the process until your opponents are dead. Barkform Harvester lines are easier to perform and explain. So the only time that you will use Pinnacle Monk lines is if you do not have access to Barkform Harvester. Pinnacle Monk's ETB trigger is also another backup way that we can win. Whenever Pinnacle Monk enters the battlefield, return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. This is relevant with a Lightning Bolt effect
in combination with either Chaos Warp or Zoyoa's Justice. Chaos Warp will always flip the top card of our library, and Zoyoa's Justice will give us Discover X, where you exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card with that mana value or less, and then you may cast it without paying its mana cost. So, Chaos Warp functions through Drannith Magistrate. Zoyoa's Justice does not. There are two different variants to this particular combo. There is one that uses Roaming Throne, being able to trigger Pinnacle Monk multiple times. And there's another one using Peter Parker's Camera, which allows you to duplicate Pinnacle Monk's trigger with Peter Parker's Camera. The difference is that Peter Parker's Camera also requires Clock of Omens, whereas Roaming Throne does not. There are also two variants for each variant. One that wins on your own turn if Maskwood Nexus has been exiled somehow, and another one that wins at instant speed with Maskwood Nexus. Ones that require your own turn require you to draw until you hit Pinnacle Monk along with your other pieces, so that Pinnacle Monk can either be the only card in your deck if you are using the Roaming Throne variant, or just to get the ETB that can be copied with Peter Parker's Camera. So the Roaming Throne variant has one specific problem, and that is if you're using Chaos Warp, Grafdigger's Cage and Torpor Orb must be inaccessible, so that means either using Legion Extruder alongside Clock of Omens to put them into play and remove both of them, or using Zoyoa's Justice specifically because the Discover effect lets you put things to hand rather than playing them. It's important if you're using the Zoyoa's Justice to not have Vexing Bubble in play, or specifically having Damping Sphere in play as well, so that every spell that you cast will cost extra mana. You may play spells without paying their mana, but it will cost you X amount more because it is the X spell of the turn that is being cast, as this is a cast. So Damping Sphere allows you to get around the downside of Vexing Bubble if you want to prevent your opponents from being able to, like, Force of Will or whatever, right? So that is a viable option. If you are using the Maskwood Nexus stuff, this is, something that can come up with the Grafdigger's Cage and stuff with Chaos Warp, but otherwise you're drawing your entire deck, and Pinnacle Monk will be the only thing that goes into it, so that's not a big deal. So, to start, we're going to assume that you're using Zoyoa's Justice. Tutor Pinnacle Monk after your Maskwood Nexus and your Roaming Throne, naming whatever. And then if you're going to use Professional Facebreaker for your drawing, then you can tutor that as well. Otherwise, you'll be using Vexing Bauble or the One Ring to draw through your deck until you have Lightning Bolt or a Lightning Bolt type effect alongside Chaos Warp or Zoyoa's Justice. In this case, we'll be using Zoyoa's Justice. You will Lightning Bolt an opponent, putting it to the graveyard. You will then Zoyoa's Justice, targeting Pinnacle Monk. Pinnacle Monk will go back in your deck. You will then discover X. You can put it into your hand, or you can play it. It doesn't really matter. If it's not Pinnacle Monk that gets discovered, then you will tutor it back out because Maskwood Nexus exists. You will get 2 ETBs. You will target your Bolt effect and your Zoyoa's Justice, and then you will repeat the process until your opponents are dead. If Pinnacle Monk needs to be done on your own turn, then you will draw your entire deck so that it is empty, play Pinnacle Monk from hand, Lightning Bolt an opponent, use the Zoyoa's Justice, Pinnacle Monk goes back in your deck, discover 5, Pinnacle Monk comes back out, cast it, repeat the process. This obviously doesn't work through silences, so that is a downside, but it is what it is.
The difference between the Roaming Throne variant and the Peter Parker's Camera variant is Clock of Omens, as well as the fact that when you are playing Pinnacle Monk, if you need to, do it on your own turn rather than at instant speed, you just need to draw it. You don't need your entire library to be empty. Again, Zoyoa's Justice is safer because of Grafdigger's Cage and Torpor Orb. Flipping into them with Chaos Warp on your first iteration of Pinnacle Monk is not ideal. For Peter Parker's Camera to work, Pinnacle Monk's trigger needs to actually go on the stack, which means that you need to have cast a spell. Again, if you are planning to use Zoyoa's Justice and you want to protect your initial casts and stuff, Vexing Bauble can be in play. However, you will need Damping Sphere as well. So let's get started. Once you have infinite untapped treasures, Tutor for Clock, Tutor for Maskwood Nexus, Tutor for Peter Parker's Camera. If you're going to use Professional Facebreaker for your draw loop, do that. Otherwise, Tutor Pinnacle Monk. If you have something in your graveyard, great, target it, and then hold priority. Otherwise, you will draw until you have a Lightning Bolt and a Zoyoa's Justice, or I should say, regardless of what happens, you will do that. Once you have that, you will Lightning Bolt an opponent. If there was nothing in your graveyard, then you will Zoyoa's Justice your Pinnacle Monk. It'll go back into your library, do the Discover thing, tutor it back out. Once you have the ETB with the Lightning Bolt in your graveyard and the Zoyoa's Justice in your graveyard, target either of them. From here, you will hold priority on the Pinnacle Monk ETB, and you will never let this resolve. You will use Peter Parker's Camera to copy it, target the Zoyoa's Justice, untap this with Clock of Omens, do it again for the Lightning Bolt, bolt an opponent, Zoyoa's Justice your Peter Parker's Camera this time, and now at this point, Cage or Torpor Orb doesn't matter, so Chaos Warp is perfectly fine. Peter Parker's Camera comes back into play, or you have to tutor it, and then you copy the trigger again, grab one of your spells, copy the trigger again, grab the other spell, bolt your opponent, Zoyoa's Justice or Chaos Warp your Peter Parker's Camera, and then repeat this process over and over until your opponents are dead. If this is done on your own turn, then instead you will draw until you hit Zoyoa's Justice or Chaos Warp, a Bolt Effect, and Pinnacle Monk. You will cast your Bolt Effect, you will cast your Pinnacle Monk, and then from there you will be able to do the thing with the Peter Parker's Camera, since the ETB will happen and you can hold priority on top of it. And then you can use the Zoyoa's Justice and stuff on the Peter Parker's Camera after getting back your bolt. So it's very convoluted, but it is one of the most efficient ways, or the most efficient way for us to win when we don't have access to Barkform Harvester. So, this is assuming that you do not have access to Barkform Harvester, and that you also don't have access to like Peter Parker's Camera or Roaming Throne, and you need to win through combat damage. The most easy way is tutor Maskwood Nexus, tutor Magda the Hoardmaster, and then make a bunch of Scorpion Dragons. This is sorcery speed, which means that there is an interaction point still technically. Even if you can activate on top to copy your Magda the Hoardmaster with Liquid Metal Torque and then Sculpting Steel, there's still technically an interaction point. You can draw your deck for SWAT and all that stuff as well with the One Ring, so it's not really that interactable, but still. There is another very cool interaction, though. And that is, grab Maskwood Nexus. Now you're going to grab Axguard Cavalry, Liquid Metal Torque, and Gogo. You can then grab Legion Extruder if you want. Doesn't really matter. You need Legion Extruder or Maskwood Nexus. From this point, you will use Liquid Metal Torque targeting Axguard Cavalry. You will go to combat. Gogo Mysterious Mime will target Axguard Cavalry. Axguard Cavalry now has haste. Make a dude, whether that is using Legion Extruder to make a 3-3 or Maskwood Nexus to make a 2-2. Use Clock of Omens to untap them. Repeat the process, make infinite dudes. Now, in the next step, you will use Axguard Cavalry that is an artifact to give all of those dudes haste. So you will activate Axguard Cavalry to give haste, use Clock of Omens to untap it, give haste, untap it, give haste, and then go to combat and punch your opponent in the face and kill them. It's really funny that Gogo gives haste and allows for this sort of an interaction, but otherwise it's just easier to use Magda the Hoardmaster. Winning through an opponent's Grafdigger's Cage is quite difficult because you don't have access to your creatures. You can't transition into infinite untapped treasures without roaming through on Battered Golem or Xorn. So in order to be able to present a win, you need to be able to remove the Grafdigger's Cage. And without something like Spine of Isha or Meteor Sword to specifically remove it, you are required to use something like an Untimely Malfunction, a Braid, Zoyoa's Justice, or Chaos Warp. The only way to do this is to have it in hand, and the mana to cast it. So what you're going to do is use the One Ring alongside all of your other artifacts in your deck to potentially draw into your answer, while trying to dodge getting all three of these in your hand, and hopefully not having Barkform Harvester in your hand as well. Or at least Barkform Harvester and Pinnacle Monk. Because you will have Peter Parker's camera in play, and you will have access to all your spells, so it is possible for you to still use Pinnacle Monk to win the game when you have access to Chaos Warp and Zoyoa's Justice, like I've talked about earlier in the video. So it's a very simple process. Use the One Ring to draw a card. Use 2 artifacts to untap the One Ring. Use the One Ring to draw 2 cards. Use 2 other artifacts to untap the One Ring. Draw 3 cards. Repeat the process. So you do this until you have an answer for their Grafdigger's Cage. You are guaranteed to have the mana that you need available because we have tons of mana rocks available to us, including things like Furdock Core, right? And then 2 of our lands are artifacts in Great Furnace and Treasure Vault. So you can make all the red mana that you need as well by being able to use your dwarf on the table to then crew vehicles and then crew vehicles into one another using Lifecraft Engine to generate red mana, instead of potentially using them for draws if necessary. This allows you to get counter magic like Red Blast, Pyroblast, Tybalt's Trickery, or SWAT effects like Return the Favor, Redirect Lightning, Deflecting SWAT, or Untimely Malfunction, so that you can defend your ability to try to remove your opponent's Grafdigger's Cage. Once their Grafdigger's Cage is removed, as long as you have access to Roaming Throne, Battered Golem, or Xorn, you can then transition into infinite untapped treasures, and then from there you can win the game as long as you have access to either Barkform Harvester or Pinnacle Monk. The downside is all of this is stopped by a silence effect, so you have to be very careful
with how you are pushing and when you're pushing. Because if someone does interact early in someone else's win attempt or whatever with a silence that resolves, this will never work, right? Because you do need to cast spells. So there is a hierarchy, basically, of what combo you should do and when. So, assuming that you have access to Barkform Harvester, the first thing that you should be looking to do is combo with Legion Extruder and Sculpting Steel as another copy of Legion Extruder. Since Legion Extruder's ability says that it must target another artifact, not itself, they can target each other. So this is the easiest one to explain, as you would have both enter, use one to kill the other, put it back in your deck with Barkform, tutor it back out, kill the original, put it back in your deck, repeat the process over and over and over again until your opponents are dead, right? Then you have the Roaming Throne variant, which is Roaming Throne, a copy of it, Maskwood Nexus, and Twin Shot Sniper. Twin Shot Sniper gets the 3 ETBs. 2 of them go in itself to put it in the graveyard. 1 goes at an opponent. Put it back in your deck with Barkform, tutor it back out, repeat. These are the 2 easiest ones because they don't require casting whatsoever. Everything is just using activated abilities. You can still use the activated ability of Twin Shot Sniper from hand, though. Channel. So a draw loop, whether that's Vexing Bauble by itself with Barkform, or the One Ring with Sculpting Steel to empty your deck, and then using Twin Shot Sniper so that it's the only other thing in your deck so that it can be drawn, blah blah blah. That is the next layer. And then if you don't have access to Twin Shot Sniper somehow because it got exiled, then you still have the ability to do both of these things with a Lightning Bolt effect. So Barkform Harvester is the first thing that you should be looking for, but if you don't have access to Barkform Harvester, then what do you do? If you don't have access to Barkform Harvester and it is not your turn, then you're required to do a loop using Pinnacle Monk as long as you have access to Maskwood Nexus to be able to tutor it out. The easier one to explain is the Roaming Throne one with both a reshuffler effect like Zoyoa's Justice or Chaos Warp alongside a Bolt effect, since Roaming Throne will double the ETB triggers. Maskwood can ensure that that's the case, obviously. That way you cast both, you have it ETB, get both back, repeat the process. If you don't have access to Roaming Throne, for whatever reason, stuck in your hand, exiled, then Peter Parker's camera allows you to do the exact same thing instead, by just copying the ETB trigger. Both of these lines are slightly complicated by comparison to other things, so do reference the sections earlier in the video for them. So the next thing to think about is if you can't do things at instant speed. So this means that it is required to be your own turn because let's say Maskwood Nexus isn't available and you also don't have access to Barkform Harvester. You can empty your deck with the One Ring alongside Infinite Treasures and Clock of Omens to allow you to do the Pinnacle Monk thing by putting all the pieces into play and then using the spells, and then this will be the only thing in your library. The downside to this is that it is susceptible to people doing force draw like Fairy Mastermind, so that is something that you need to keep in mind. Obviously you can kill the Fairy Mastermind and stuff before doing this, so it's not that big of a deal, but you do have to think about that. If for whatever reason Pinnacle Monk isn't available, whether it's as a land and your Chaos Warp has been exiled or something, or you're not playing it for some reason, then you have to go to a combat-based approach, which is Magda the Hoardmaster, if it is main phase 1, where you're making all of your Scorpion Dragons, or at the beginning of combat with Gogo's trigger resolved on X-Guard Cavalry with Liquid Metal Torque, and then using Maskwood Nexus to make infinite dudes, and then making them have haste because Gogo gives Axguard haste. It is a artifact that can be untapped with Clock of Omens, so that you can give all of the shapeshifters that you make haste. So this has to be done before declare attackers as well. So regardless of which one you're doing, they, are both viable. Just keep in mind that Magda the Hoardmaster's thing is sorcery speed, so if someone has a way to kill it at split second speed or whatever, there's not really much that you can do about it. But if you have access to your whole deck, all your SWAT effects and all that stuff, it shouldn't be a big issue. And then lastly, we have just something that is cute, which is if your opponent is trying to win with the ETB of Thoracle, and you're able to win on top of them, you can use Professional Facebreaker or the One Ring to empty your library, and then win by return the favoring the ETB trigger of Thassa's Oracle, and then winning on top since your devotion will be 0 and you'll have nothing in your library.
So now let's sort of discuss all the cards individually. We have Grafdigger's Cage. Creature cards in graveyards and libraries can't enter the battlefield. Players can't cast spells from graveyards or libraries. So, this shuts down Tymna Dargo. This shuts down Breach. This shuts down all green to field tutors. Shuts down Cannon activations, Winota. It shuts down Rocco. It shuts down a lot of different things. Makes Indala work a little bit harder. So there are so many things in the format, win conditions, all that stuff. Sisay has a lot of creatures that it would tutor out. Even if the Planeswalker lines are the main combo-centric thing, you still do have some Sisay players that are playing Chowder, right? That are playing like Breach-centric things or 5-color good stuff piles and all that stuff. Similarly, ETBs are a problem, right? So Torpor Orb is our answer to Thoracle, answer to the ETBs of things like OBM, to things like Gilded Drake, the new Formidable Speaker, Atali. There are a lot of different things that can get shut off. Like, Rocco doesn't function as a deck with Torpor Orb in play, usually. In a lot of cases. So, like, there's a lot of value in turning off, Cloud of Fairies and other ETB effects like Spellseeker or Eternal Witness, etc. Like, it's just an annoying card to fight through. Grafdigger's Cage also stops reanimation, which is important. Like, it is becoming more common to see things like Hulk or Tymna Dargo, which are using Technomancer lines and stuff like that. So Grafdigger's Cage really is almost ubiquitous as far as how it interacts with the format. Now, that being said, we then have Disruptor Flute and Pithing Needle. There are so many activated abilities in the format that are powerful. You have Sisay, Kinnan, Thrasios. You have specific creatures that are powerful, like Warren Soul Trader, or Chatterfang in some very specific lists, right? You have the ability to turn off things like Altar of Dementia or Goblin Bombardment for Tymna Dargo. There are a lot of other things that can be shut off. But there's also things that can't, right? Like, if you're not running single target removal for anything, like Spine of Isha, then having an answer to someone trying to win with like Squee and making infinite mana with Food Chain, then we have Disruptor Flute. Because Squee will then cost 6 mana, right? Or Damping Sphere, which would make that cost 1 mana more each time that Squee is cast. Disruptor Flute also serves as interaction because it has flash. And it stops breach lines because you can name LED or any number of things, right? You can stop a grinding station from being activated. You can prevent a mana vault from being replayed over and over and over again. There's a lot of value that Disruptor Flute has as long as you know what the other decks in the format are doing. Even though it is just single target stuff, there are plenty of times where you're playing against multiple Thrasios, or a Kinnan in a Thrasios, and Thrasios kind of hits both of them, because Thrasios is eventually needed for Kinnan to win at instant speed, in a lot of cases. So, yeah. Then you have Damping Sphere. This is anti-storm, so you have stuff like Ral, like VV, etc., that this makes it so they can't really function. Similarly, you have Vexing Bauble to stop Itali, Ral. It makes storm turns harder, right? So, even though this isn't like quite ubiquitous in the format, like it still slows breach decks down. They can't cast their stuff for free. You know, Damping Sphere does the exact same thing. Though Vexing Bauble stops specifically, you know, LED and Lotus Petal and stuff from being cast altogether. Similarly, when talking about the graveyard, Unlicensed Hearse is very powerful because the amount of cards that your opponents need for breach lines are very specific, and sometimes taking 2 of those away is all you need. There are situations where your opponents can play through you having Unlicensed Hearse available because they're going to need mana for casting their Brain Freeze. Depending on how many times they're casting things before the Brain Freeze, getting rid of a LED in the graveyard is technically possible if they're on a very tight line. Where they have to leave it in the graveyard where they're casting their Brain Freeze so that they can continue, right? But otherwise, it's mostly just for reanimation targets, which is powerful enough. And then, kind of lastly, we have Portal of Phyrexia, which there are plenty of board states on turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, where this does huge amounts of damage to our opponent's boards. And if we're, you know, in a situation where we've had creatures die, whether it's from Bowmaster or whatever, or our Xorn gets countered, or our Rumming Throne gets countered, or whatever, Portal can give us access to them if a cage isn't in play, right? So it can pull double duty. This being copied sucks. So does like a Disruptor Flute or a Pithing Needle if your opponent like uses a Phyrexia Metamorph, but those are the most successful type of silver bullets that are available in the format. You know, playing hard stacks is no longer really something we're doing, like God Pharaoh Statue or the Sphere effects. Some players are playing them, right? But usually these aren't tutor targets. So when you are trying to consider the stacks that you're playing, you know, sure, these things can come out early. God Pharaoh's definitely isn't, unless it's a tutor target. or unless you have like some crazy workshop hand or something, right? Which the main mid-range list is not running. So, yeah. I think that overall we have sped up a little bit. We don't really want to be defensively tutoring. Defensively tutoring, period, is only to stop an opponent from winning the game in dire situations, because there's no dockside anymore. We can't just wait for opponents to have enough treasures or artifacts to be able to just win on the spot with a dockside, right? So that's changed how our activations need to be used, and in general, like, defensive tutors have never been all that strong unless you have layered stacks. So yeah, it's a change to the deck a little bit, going away from God Pharaohs and moon effects and stuff, but the pieces that we currently have available to us for silver bullets and stacks are strong enough to deal with a vast majority of the meta, especially if we are tutoring for them.
So when you think about our tutor targets now, it's primarily going to be things like Grafdigger's Cage, Torpor Orb to stop a Thoracle from ETBing, right? Damping Sphere in some very specific situations. Disruptor Flute or Pithing Needle in a pinch. Removal for things like Legion Extruder if it's a single target that Portal to Phyrexia isn't going to hit at the time. A lot of our defensive tutors are no longer a thing, right? We're not layered hard stacks anymore. At least this variant of the build is not. So you're not overlapping Magus of the Moon and God Pharaoh statue to like force a long drawn out game that you just eventually walk to a win, right? It's very specific as far as what you're going to be tutoring for and why. So you have our stopping our opponents and understanding meta deck section of the primer. And this goes over all the different combos and all the different decks in the format, where you can interact, what they're weak to, etc. And a lot of times there is going to be overlap where like Grafdigger's Cage stops a Tyam and a Kinnan and an Anala, and thumbs up, right? But you really have to make your defensive tutors matter, because a majority of the time when you are defensively tutoring, you're forced to do so, and it's going to more likely end in a draw. Especially when you are doing so to stop a single player, right? Whether that's with a Disruptor Flute type effect, or a Damping Sphere, or a Cage, or whatever, right? Like, some of these things are very susceptible to just being bounced and you lose the game. But that's always been the case, even with, like, God Pharaoh statue. So, understanding what to do is all about understanding the meta, your particular game, and your board state. You know, obviously, going for things like Lifecraft Engine or Fur.Core Core makes sense when you're stuck under your own Grafdigger's Cage or someone else's, but other than that, a lot of our stuff is just face up. You know, we're going to be tutoring for our roaming throne in a lot of situations. But when you are going for other things, it's all just getting used to the format and getting used to, you know, the win conditions of other decks and where they are susceptible to being interacted with in those particular combo lines. So everything takes some getting used to, and again, I would just use this section that I wrote. Obviously, there are some decks that are a lot less fleshed out as far as their combos and, you know, all that stuff, but whereas relevant, it should be there. A thing I should mention for this particular section, though, is that there are cards that are not currently being played in the list that may make their way back in. Things like Null Rod and Orb of Dreams, as examples, were things that were played when Dockside was relevant. God Pharaoh statue is an answer to a lot of problems, But you'll notice that there's a lot of overlap as well. So as an example, with Lion's Eye Diamond or Lotus of Petal on the stack, you can get Disruptor Flute naming Lion's Eye Diamond or Lotus Petal, depending on the situation, right? Or you may be able to go and get Unlicensed Hearse to deal with something in the graveyard you know that you don't want them recasting in response to them casting the thing. Or, just putting a Damping Sphere into play instead of a Godfarer statue. It's still difficult to win under those circumstances, especially because Damping Sphere tracks the total amount of cards played for the turn. So if they've played 3 or 4 cards to get to the point where they're comboing off with Breach, and then Damping Sphere comes into play, they're no longer going to be able to Breach. And then you have all the other generic win conditions like Thoracle Decon for Torpor Orb for Dualcaster Mage stuff. Some of the different ways that you can interact with Hullbreaker Horror or Tidespout lines. Food Chain is mostly specifically using Damping Sphere or Disruptor Flute on either Squee, Mist Hollow Griffin, or Eternal Scourge, because it makes them net negative as far as the amount of mana that they're generating. And then the other option is that there are a lot of ETB triggers for Food Chain decks, so you can go and grab a Torpor Orb, like if you're trying to shut down an Atraxa or something, right? That isn't currently listed, but I will make sure to try to get that added. But yeah, so it's relatively robust as far as all of that stuff goes. And generic combos are things that are mentioned for every deck that do play them. And then you have, the commander-specific stuff like where you can interact with some of the Sisay lines, interacting with Time Sieve or whatever. I'll go through and update this a little bit more before releasing this video, but you get the idea, and hopefully this is helpful. You have infinite tapped treasures. Can you transition into a win basically no matter what? The answer is realistically yes. The split-second spells, Trickbind, Corrosion Grip, and Sudden Shock are the biggest dampers to you potentially being able to do that. Sudden Shock is only seen in our own deck, really, and it's going to get used before you make infinite treasures. Same thing with Corrosion Grip. It's not really seen much in CEDH. There are a few players specifically that like having it, but outside of those players, you're never going to interact with it, so don't worry about it. And again, this will happen before you go infinite. The only one that you have to worry about post-infinite is Trickbind. So, once you have infinite treasures, some people like to be cheeky with Trickbind and, stop you from doing whatever. The correct choice is to stop your Clock of Omens from being able to make infinite treasures, or, make Battered Golem's triggered ability not be able to trigger again, etc., etc. So Trickbind can stop you again before you make infinite treasures. But once you've made infinite treasures, it cannot stop you. Because you can activate Magda, hold priority, activate Magda, hold priority, repeat the process until you have a million activations on the stack, and then Trickbind doesn't do shit. Because if they Trickbind your Barkform Harvester, if they Trickbind whatever it is that you're trying to use for winning the game, you can just make a copy of it. So whether that's with Sculpting Steel or, Liquid Metal Torquing something and then Sculpting Stealing that, like if Magda gets shut off and you don't feel comfortable using the activations you have on the stack, then, that is a viable option. But outside of that, Trickbind is kind of gimmicky against us. It can stop us from making infinite treasures, but post-infinite, it doesn't really do anything if you carefully play around it. And this card also isn't seen all that often. It's in some hard control lists. It's also just in some lists that get play in the Northeast because, for whatever reason, players up here like that card.
it is one of the few answers to Thassa's Oracle in blue. So, or outside of counters, right? So yeah, it's something to consider, but not really worry all that much about. As long as you activate Magda a million times holding priority, there's basically nothing that can be done. Now, the next point of contention is, well, we use the graveyard for our win conditions in the way the deck is currently put together. At least a majority of the instant speed ones. Both Barkform Harvester and Pinnacle Monk require using the graveyard. So, this is true, but it's not a problem. Specifically, if you have the One Ring in your deck, you can just draw basically every card in your library, right? So, let's start with Dothy Voidwalker. Dothy Voidwalker is a 3/2, which means it dies to all of our removal. So, yes, your removal will get put under Dothy, but that doesn't matter because Dothy is going to die. And the spell needs to resolve before it goes to the graveyard, which means that they can't bolt you back or whatever, right? So Dothy's not a problem. Similarly, Rest in Peace is also not a problem, because once you're able to draw with the One Ring, as long as you have Liquid Metal Torque in play, you can make Rest in Peace into a artifact, and then kill it with a shatter effect, like a Braid or Untimely Malfunction. And then you have other things that target things in the graveyard, like Endurance or Agatha's Soul Cauldron. If you're winning with Barkform Harvester, this is not a problem, because you just put another activation of Barkform Harvester over the top of them trying to get rid of the thing in your graveyard. If you're trying to win with Pinnacle Monk, it is also not a problem as long as you have Peter Parker's camera available, and as long as there is a ETB trigger on the stack. So if you've targeted something with it, your ETB trigger is still going to be on the stack, and they have to respond to that before that ETB trigger resolves. So that will be the case. So then Peter Parker's camera can then be used to copy the trigger again, and then get back specifically either Zoyoa's Justice or Chaos Warp for you to do the thing, right? The only way for you to be stopped is if Barkform Harvester is not accessible. You must win with Pinnacle Monk, and someone silences you. If it is your own turn and it's pre-main phase or pre-combat, you can still win with Magda the Hoardmaster and Maskwood Nexus, infinite dudes with X-Guard Cavalry giving things haste via Gogo and stuff. So only in main phase 2 is that really a problem. Otherwise, we basically have answers for everything. Some of it requires some creativity, but as Magda can just activate over the top of something, there's almost never a problem with you going and getting the thing that you want to get. So the graveyard is sort of the only place where you need to worry about interaction, and Grafdigger's Cage doesn't matter after Barkform Harvester is in play, because things aren't actually coming from the graveyard into play. They're going back into your deck. Creatures, specifically for Grafdigger's Cage, are shut off, so you would need to win with Legion Extruder and Sculpting Steel at that point. But that's a very specific situation, and it also requires your opponents to have a Grafdigger's Cage. And if your opponents have a Grafdigger's Cage, you can just use the One Ring again, grab a Shatter effect, and blow up their Grafdigger's Cage. So there, again, is very few situations where your opponents actually ever have an out once you have infinite taps treasures. Angel's Grace is pretty interesting.
we can't win through it on an opponent's turn. And previously, our way to win through it on our own turn was with God Pharaoh's statue. Using the end step trigger, you could copy that trigger a bunch, usually with something like Return the Favor, or in this case, we got Peter Parker's camera. So you could kill the table with Life Drain. Since Life Drain is not damage, it would put an opponent to 0, or all of your opponents to 0. Angel's Grace would wear off. There would be a state-based actions check. Everyone is at 0 life at that point, so they will die before your turn actually truly ends. Now, it's really important to understand that state-based actions happen after the end of turn effects wear off. This includes when a vehicle that has been crewed and is a creature becomes just an artifact vehicle again and is no longer a creature. So, removing an equipment or aura or whatever from an illegal permanent is a state-based action, and every state-based action in cleanup gives priority. A new cleanup step happens until one without a state-based action occurs. So, what this means is, if you have an equipment attached to a vehicle, and it ceases to be a creature, this is an illegal object, an equipped vehicle. So the game has to remedy this as a state-based action, which will de-equip the Stalactite Dagger or the Lightning Greaves or whatever. And this causes a new round of priority and a new cleanup step. When you gain priority, you can then kill the table, because Angel's Grace and all other things that happen until end of turn will have expired, and there is a new cleanup step. So, it's a very academic rules thing, but this is how we now are able to win through Angel's Grace effect. It doesn't win through the One Ring, but that's okay. The One Ring specifically, you kill all of your opponents, except for the person with the One Ring, and then let them go into their upkeep and then kill them in their upkeep. Because it will force that player to be the next in turn order. This is only a problem if it is the final turn of the game. Specifically the Angel's Grace on your own turn as the final turn of the game as well. Otherwise, you can just kill everyone in the next player's upkeep, right? So, this is a very, very niche scenario, but it is something that you should understand exists for the deck, especially now that God Pharaohs is something I'm not currently suggesting that people play. And thank you to Neon on the Magda Discord server for that academic explanation as to why you are able to win with equipment, or why you gain priority in cleanup step when equipment is forced to fall off of a vehicle. This section is to cover some cards that some pilots do run that the Magdanomicon does not, and some of the reasons why. There is an entire section in the primer going over cards that require further explanation, some of the pros and cons, some of them just have explanations as to why they are ran or why they are not. But let's talk about some of the cards that we don't run anymore. I already talked earlier about Engineer and Welder a little bit, as well as Academy Manufacturer, but these cards are unfortunately just too slow. Engineer and Welder used to be one of the main combo lines back when we also used to play things like Iriad's Tempting Apple. But now that we've gotten quite a bit higher card quality, these things unfortunately are just too slow or don't do enough. Academy Manufacturer doesn't make extra treasures unless you have an extra copy of him, and the draws that you get off of the clues are not really enough to warrant spending 3 mana on this, since you both need the mana available to crack the clues, and you need a board state that can generate the clues and the food and stuff, right? So
Well, yes, this card in the past was played. There was a long time where it wasn't because it fed Dockside, right? It disappeared for a while, was tested again once Dockside was banned, and it was still found to just not be good enough. Let's talk about dragons. We are actually on dragons technically because of changelings, but stuff like Realm Scorcher Hellkite are basically cards that are almost there just as win the game cards. This particular card in the past was used as a win condition because of the ability to just pump mana into it and deal damage to any target, so your opponents. Before this was Skargan Hellkite, which did the exact same thing, just for more mana for 2 damage instead. But again, even back then, a lot of the pilots were on the Engineer and Welder variants of combo lines instead because they had slightly higher card quality at the time. But Realm Scorcher Hellkite is basically just a 4/6 flyer that doesn't really do much. Sure, you can pressure life totals, which may be good against Nas and Necro decks, but realistically, you're not getting much out of this, and bargaining something away to essentially play this for 2 mana if you have this 6 mana available is not necessarily where you want to be spending your mana most of the time anyway. It's not bad if you're able to bargain, but it will usually cost you a treasure. So you're at least paying 1 treasure and 2 red. It's okay, but again, card quality is very important for the deck, and this is mostly just there as a win condition. You'll notice this is kind of a trend. Reckless Fireweaver. Again, this is a card that is mostly there just as a win condition. If Grafdigger's Cage is in play either for you or yourself, you cannot tutor this even if you have Maskwood in play. So having a way to win without necessarily transitioning into infinite untapped treasures doesn't really matter. It's just a shortcut piece that allows you to easily explain how you kill your opponents. But a lot of our combos are also very streamlined, even the ones that use recursion from the graveyard, so it shouldn't really be that big of a deal. And myself, Rust, and other pilots are very much of the opinion that cards should not be in the deck for one purpose, unless it does that thing way better than anything else, which this does not. Strandhanger Automaton. This is another version of Battered Golem that doesn't allow you to win through blind obedience type effects. But it does technically win you the game because your treasures make you Thopters, and if you have Maskwood in play, those Thopters can then tap to make treasures and then go infinite that way. This is also too slow, just like Academy Manufacturer, and the type of board states where this is very strong, you're basically already winning the game anyway, so it's really difficult to warrant going for this, because in most of the time, you can just go and get Roaming Throne, make the treasures you need to go get Clock, and still win the game, right? Because in those situations, you still need a vehicle, and the Clock and the extra treasure that you would have from the 2 Dwarves and Roaming Throne would still allow you to win the game, using those to untap it to allow you to crew, make infinite tap treasures that way, and then go from there. Altar of the Brood. Breach is a thing, and while yes, hitting important things in the early game may be great for you, feeding Breach is really bad. And it's when another permanent that you have under your control enters, it causes each opponent to put the top card of his or her library into their graveyard, right? So if you're making 3 treasures per turn or more, you're going to feed a entire cycle of Breach every time that you're making your treasures. Or if you're playing a dwarf or whatever, like, it's just not usually where you want to be, unless you're like doing this in response to someone, top deck tutoring or something, which is very niche. This is also basically just there as an I win card. usually in combination with something that forces your opponents to draw, like a Temple Bell or something. But realistically, that's not something you should be putting in. The card quality is very low, but it is an option, I guess, if that is something that you feel passionate about, that it is the correct decision to, want to make people be able to force draw a game, right? Because you can also force yourself to draw your deck in other ways, and then you can force everyone to draw a card and lose that way to the Temple Bell, right? Unless someone is cheeky and has a endurance or something. Iriot's Tempting Apple was good a while back, but now that Goblin Welder is gone, combos with it don't really exist outside of using it as a win condition with Barkform Harvester. And paying 4 mana to get a Threaten effect or a Claim the Firstborn or whatever just isn't strong enough, unfortunately. Memory Jar was seen in the past. It is no longer seen. Again, it's similar to the whole thing about drawing your opponents out. Usually, you would rather have Torpor Orb to stop a Thoracle player from winning the game, but this just kills that player instead. That is an option, but again, Temple Bell does the exact same thing, so Memory Jar isn't really necessary for that sort of thing. But this was a combo card in the past. And then we've gone over Spine of Isha and stuff. It's just, this or Meteor Sword is so expensive and doesn't really solve any problem that we can't already solve, other than being able to have an answer through a silence effect to remove an opponent's Grafdigger's Cage. Or something very specific on board that, is going to end up getting you a draw. So if you value that, then you can play Meteor Sword instead of Spine of Isha. But it's not something that I suggest. There are cards with better card quality, but if you like a catch-all answer, then playing Meteor Sword is acceptable. Mulliganing on Magda is more difficult than quite a few other decks in the format because we don't have card draw that we can rely on to get us back into the game. So when you are mulliganing with Magda, you're basically getting your opening hand and then between 1 and 9 cards depending on how many turns you see and if you play a Jessica's Will or not. Or if you have a Smuggler's Copter that can draw discard and stuff like that. So there's not really a lot that you can really look to do outside of your opening hand and the stuff that Magda makes treasure-wise that can get you to interaction or helping your board state by putting things into play, right? Your main game plan is always going to be make treasures, use treasures to find a way to win the game. So that is fundamental. This is an opening hand as an example. If you were to keep it as a 7, would be relatively powerful. There's no turn 1 play, but there's turn 2 Magda, turn 3 Furdock Core into Magda the Hoardmaster, and stuff like that. You will have access to 4 mana on turn 3 because you have 3 lands, one of them being a City of Traders. And then you have a Damping Sphere depending on the pod as to if this is going to be powerful. Then you have more mana available. If Magda dies, you have Furdock Core as something that's not going to necessarily go away to creature removal, but it does need to resolve. That is a problem. So we're going to be using Eldrazi.dev for this demonstration. We're going to be going through a few different pods, go through some reasoning and maybe some of the play patterns that each of the hands might give you, and then we'll look at some of the cards that we will draw to see how that game will have gone. So looking at this opening hand, our turn 1 draw is actually a turn 1 Dwarf, which makes this actually better because you have turn 1 Dwarf into turn 2 Magda into turn 3 Furdock Core, which is just a win potentially on turn 4. And then your other draws are land and land. So this particular pod that we're looking at is Dargo Timna, Timnacrom, Sisay, and us. So the hand that I was talking about as a first 7 would be perfectly fine, or a second 7 would be perfectly fine. Damping Sphere early helps shut off a lot of these decks. It doesn't do as much to Sisay unless they're on a version that's like trying to use Cradle a little bit more, but letting Sisay and TNK kind of control the Tim the Dargo is kind of where you're looking to be at, especially in Z4. But let's reset the pod. So this is 3 lands, 2 1-drop dwarves, 2 pieces of interaction, which is not bad into this pod because Tim the Dargo needs to use some creature combos, and Sisay has a lot of creature-based things that you want to make sure don't stay in play. So having the interaction here with the 2 dwarves is good. And you can also play this out turn 1, see what people play out as far as their things, and then potentially wipe the board of like 2 Esper Sentinels and a Dork or something. Because you have another 1-drop dwarf and a Magda that you can, do things with after that. So that is another viable play pattern. And because of the flexibility and the pod, I think this is a perfectly keepable hand. Let's go one more time in this pod. We have 1 land here, you can't keep it. This is 1 land, but the rest of the hand is completely insane. You have Jeska's Will, you have Furdok Core, you have Gogo. So you have a 29.3% chance to see another land. In this particular pod, I'm just keeping this hand and praying. Because if I do runner, land, this is a very, very powerful hand. Because in this pod, this Jeska's Will is going to resolve. So it's turn 1 Dwarf, turn 2 Magda, turn 3 Jeska's Will. Potentially put Furdok Core and Gogo into play off of that. And then you may be able to win the game. Or at the very least, getting Gogo off of your Jeska's Will on turn 3 means that you're going to get enough treasures to get an activation, and that activation is going to allow you to dictate the tempo of the game, and Portal of Phyrexia and stuff can be quite powerful as far as shutting some of the board states down. So let's see if our runner happens. Runner? No runner. But still being able to go turn 1 Magda, turn 1 Dwarf, turn 2 Magda, and then from there you're able to get things to resolve or play out. You're not very fast, but you're going to be able to use that 3rd mana on the next turn to Chaos Warp something if you need to, or Furdok Core, or Gogo if you're able to resolve your Jeska's Will and they have enough cards in hand. So like, it's decent enough. But if you're not willing to keep risky hands, something like this also is not going to work because it doesn't have a game plan. You have a Vexing Bauble, which is not great in Seat 4, and then you have a free spell, which you're going to be using to control the board. You have a vehicle, you have 2 lands, and a mana rock that can turn things into a dwarf. So like, this is good if you're going to use this on like turn 1 and you go like land, Simian Spirit Guide, Magda, hold up Pyrokinesis, hoping that you draw a red card. It's okay. Especially because the following turn you can go Flywheel Racer, and if you draw into gas, you're good. And you can deploy this if you want to in some situations, but it may also protect the Tim to Dargo. So it can be risky. So I'm going to mulligan this. This is a snap keep. You have turn 1 Dwarf, turn 2 Magda, turn 3 Xorn. Or technically turn 1 Magda, turn 2 Xorn. Or sorry, turn 1 Dwarf, turn 2 Xorn, turn 3 Magda, depending on how you want to do things. Or turn 1 Magda, turn 2 Xorn. That is another viable option. And then the following turn you'd be able to make 4 treasures, and if you have any other dwarf whatsoever, you may be able to get to an activation by turn 3. That seems worth it. So this is definitely a keep. If you have to go down to 5 here, even though this is a creature pod, you're going to get rid of a Braid, and you're probably going to have to get rid of Simian Spirit Guide here and play a little bit slower. Going turn 1 Enslaved Dwarfs, turn 2 Magda, turn 3 Xorn into an activation is probably where you're going to have to be. And then your 3 draws are another Dwarf, a Clown Car, and an Untimely Malfunction. So this is just a win. Because starting with Xorn, you're able to go get Roaming Throne. You have enough 1-drop dwarves that you're going to be able to ladder into another copy of Roaming Throne and then win the game that way. So yeah, this is potentially a turn 3 win. No, this is a turn 3 win. So let's make a new pod. Kinnan, us, TNK, TNK. We have turn 1 nothing unless we play a City of Traders. Because that would let us get a Battle Bus. You can technically go turn 1 Battle Bus, turn 2 Xorn, turn 3 Magda, and then you're going to be making 2 treasures, and then if you draw any dwarves, it's quite powerful. That's another option. Peter Parker's camera being able to double triggers for Magda here also generates 2 treasures instead of 1. So that's pretty powerful. This is like a risky keep, but it is technically keepable because it does give you that activation by like turn 4. Your runner would be Artifact Dwarf and a land, which is actually kind of helpful. So it's a potential win on turn 4. So into double TNK and Kinnan, turn 1 Grafdigger's Cage is the bee's knees. Because you're able to go turn 1 Grafdigger's Cage, turn 2 Axeguard Cavalry, turn 3 Magda Clown Car, and then the following turn you're able to do Knuckles. So that's quite insane because you also get your 3rd Dwarf. This is a snap keep in this pod. You also have the option to go turn 1 Dwarven Armorer, turn 2 Magda Clown Car, make 2 treasures, play Axeguard Cavalry, make a treasure, use that for Grafdigger's Cage, and then the following turn you make treasures before combat, play Knuckles, make 2 more treasures, get to 4, and then you're 1 treasure away on turn 3, which is pretty powerful. So there's a few different lines that you can take here, and they're all similarly viable. So I keep this. This hand doesn't really have anything going for it. It has a counterspell, a Vexing Bubble, and then like interaction plus a Maskwood Nexus, so we're pitching this. I am keeping this hand. Into TNK and Kinnan, Damping Sphere is very powerful. We also have a Roaming Throne. We have a way to make a dwarf for colorless, and then we have a way to use that dwarf to play Magda the following turn. And then we also have a tapper, which means the following turn after that we get to play Roaming Throne. And then potentially just win the game. So this is a potential turn 3 win. Our runner on this hand are Red Land and City of Traders. We are definitely winning on turn 3. One more with this pod. We have turn 1 Dwarf, turn 2 Magda, turn 3 Torpor Orb. Torpor Orb doesn't shut off a whole lot of stuff for Kinnan, but it does force these decks to go with Breach. That being said, you also have a Deflecting Swat available and a Plundering Barbarian if Kinnan's board state gets a little bit too out of hand. So it's not a terrible hand. This is perfectly keepable in Seat 2. It may be a little bit slow, but also you kind of want these decks dealing with each other and not you. So going a little bit slow is probably worthwhile. And if this doesn't resolve, then you know that one of them has Historical. Let's change pod. Us, Terra, Magda, Kinnan. So this is a double Magda pod. Not really where you want to be. We'll mulligan this. We have a Gogo here, but we don't really have a way to get to the mana to play Gogo fast enough with another Magda in Seat 1. In this particular pod, making sure that we don't have a board state that really makes it worthwhile for Magda to use a portal is ideal. Or we outvalue them by going faster. So this is just going to be too slow. This is way better. It's 3 lands, a Xorn, an Artifact Dwarf, and a Dwarven Armorer. So, yes, this is a risky hand as far as potentially them getting an activation before us. But we will be able to attack into them in most cases. So, you have a turn 1 Dwarven Armorer, turn 2 Magda, turn 3 Xorn, which puts you at an activation before the other Magda in a lot of pods in a lot of situations. And then you're able to portal, and with your portal, you being able to have Universal Automaton in hand, and a Xorn available, you're probably just winning that game. Unless there is interaction. You also have Red Blast for dealing with either Kinnan or Terra. So this is a perfectly keepable hand. First 7, no lands, can't keep it. Second 7, we have a turn 1 Relic of Legends, turn 2 Magda, and a bunch of interaction. So we have a Braid that can keep the other Magda off the field early, potentially. We have a tap, or a way to tap to make Magda have a way to generate treasures, and then we have a Professional Facebreaker. This is a little bit slow, but it is a decent way to go about the game. The opponent doesn't get that much value from our board if they do get out ahead of us. Magda just dies, and then we still have 3 of the 4 mana available to help replay Magda while having some interaction. So this is still quite potent and potentially worth keeping. That being said, it is slow, so the other Magda in Seat 1 can get out far ahead of you, and you are forced to abrade their Magda. So if you go turn 2 Magda, then you abrade their Magda, that's the most... That's probably the situation that's going to happen. So that's fine. And if you draw dwarves, then you can do that too. So yeah, I keep this. Let's make a new pod. Double Magd is annoying. Rogthras, Najeela, Y'shtola, and us in seat 4. So we have a kind of Stax-ish deck. A Najeela and then a Rogthras in seat 1. This doesn't really have a game plan other than get a turn 1 Magda, make a treasure the following turn, maybe hold up the treasure for Lightning Bolt on something from Rogthras or Najeela or something. It's just, there's not much there. There's not enough mana generation to get to Xorn. So, Mulligan. This is fine. We have a Dwarf in our Mutavault. We have a Disruptor Flute for either Rogthras or Najeela. And then, if you draw a tap outlet, you are 1 card away from being able to win. Or 1 tutor away from being able to win with Battered Golem. So it's not bad. In this pod specifically because of Rogthras and Najeela, I keep it because of Disruptor Flute. And the fact that you technically have, turn 1 Dwarf, turn 2 Magda, turn 3 Mutavault is going to help you cast your Magda the Hoardmaster, which puts you at like 4 treasures. And yeah, so I'm going to keep this for second 7. What we get is Peter Parker's Camera, a 1-drop Dwarf, and a land. So the 1-drop Dwarf is actually quite helpful, and Peter Parker's Camera lets you double activate. So this is potentially just a win on your first activation. You don't have any lands, can't keep it, obviously. So this is interesting because you have turn 1 Balin's Tomb for Flywheel Racer, play out Universal Automaton, make a red. You can then play Magda, make a treasure, play your dwarf, and then you have a Pithing Needle for both Rograk or Najeela, or Thrasios or Najeela, and then you also have a 1 ring in hand that can be cast the following turn from your treasures and your mana that you have. So while yes, this is risky, I'm definitely keeping this in Z4. New pod. Us, Itali, Kinnan, Sisse. So this is potentially a turn 2 Roaming Throne with turn 1 Mana Vault, and then you have a Xorn in hand. So it's turn 1 Mana Vault, turn 2 Roaming Throne if you get a land, or turn 2 Magda if you want to be slow, and then turn 3 Roaming Throne, make 2 treasures. You're able to hold up interaction for Sisse and Kinnan. You have a redirect lightning. So it's a very risky keep, but sometimes in seat 1 or seat 4 you risk it for the biscuit, right? So in this case, because Roaming Throne is in hand and Xorn, you're 1 red source away. Alternatively, you can also use Mana Vault to pump into Treasure Vault to make a red if necessary. But that shouldn't be something you need to do. So if you decide to keep this, which is risky, you have a Unlicensed Hearse, a land, and this. So you end up getting hard punished. But sometimes it happens that way. If you're Rust, then you draw red source off the top, and you're fine. As a first 7 or second 7, this isn't keepable. So this is a 6. 2 lands, Damping Sphere for the Itali, and the Kinnan. Yeah, you can keep this as a 6. it's a little bit risky because it's like Magda, make a treasure, play your Lifecraft engine, do the thing, get to the next turn, hopefully play Gogo, win the game. So yeah, by turn 3 you have enough to do the thing, which is all you really care about. So you wouldn't have been punished in that case. Start from the beginning. So this is interesting because you have turn 1 Command Beacon, Mopal, Mana Vault, tap Mana Vault for a Liquid Metal Torque, Liquid Metal Torque, and Mox Opal for Magda. And then the following turn, well, you have 3. This is 2 of the 3. This puts you at 4. So yeah, you also get a Unlicensed Hearse here. And then during the turn cycle, someone will do something. You can use this and then make a treasure. So that's an insane, turn 1. So I am keeping that. So this might seem incredibly troll. But this is a turn 2 Tezzeret with a turn 1 Vexing Bauble into Etali and Kinnan. It's a very slow hand, but you do have a Tapper, a Battered Golem, and a Magda. You have a way to get a red source off of Tezzeret, and you also have 3 mana, if necessary, to put Battered Golem in to make red with Holdout Settlement. So if this is second 7, this is probably potentially worth keeping because of Tezzeret. And because Vexing Bauble prevents Etali from just winning the game. So if you want a defensive hand because of Vexing Bauble on turn 1, it's perfectly viable. It also depends on what we draw, right? There are plenty of draws for this hand to become insane. So that's why I keep it. So draw 1 is Pyroblast, doesn't really help us. Draw 2 is a land, which is good. Draw 3 is Torpor Orb, which double fucks Etali. And depending on the version of Sisay, makes some of their lines a little bit harder. No Derevi, Emil, and stuff, so it's passable. Especially when you're turn 2 making a mountain and you have, enough to play Magda, make a treasure, play Magda the Hoardmaster after playing a Vexing Bauble. Yeah. One more with this pod. Unkeepable. I mean, it's not unkeepable. In seat 1, you also have Vexing Bauble again. So it's like, you have 2 turns to draw a second land, and then you have a vehicle, you have a Bottle Cap Blast, and a Knuckles. So it's like, this hand is very much positioned to do the thing, and there's not really much interaction as far as removing Magda in the pod. So you're relatively safe to prevent Etali from just winning the game. This is another risky keep. I think Rust probably keeps something like this. I might pitch it back. It depends. And you end up getting hard punished if you keep it. So, new pod. Kinnan, Rogthras, us, Rel. So we have no red source, we can't keep it.
This is insane into Rel. It's a You also have a braid for the Kinnan stuff, and Rogthras is just going to do Rogthras things. But this is a turn 1 Urza Saga into Mana Vault into Stalactite Dagger, or use Vexing Bauble first, and then Stalactite Dagger. And this gives you a Dork, or a Dwarf, right? And then you have a Urza Saga that can get you a Grafdigger's Cage if necessary against these two, or it can get you an Artifact Dwarf. There's, a lot of ways that this can go. You also have a way to turn a vehicle into a Artifact Dwarf, so that's also very powerful. You have plenty of mana. This is keepable, especially in Terrell. You want to make sure that they don't get to exist, and then these two get to fight each other. No second land, unfortunately. This doesn't really do anything. You have a turn 1 Clown Car with a Peter Parker's camera into turn 2 Magda, and then you get to hold up Red Blast. And that's okay for Ral, but it's not like the best. It's also okay for Kinnan. You're not going to be generating treasures fast enough, but you will be able to get an Artifact Dwarf from your Urza Saga. So it's one of those things where on turn 3, you'll be one turn away from being able to win the game, and by that point you're using your Dork. If you have any, or your Artifact Dwarf, if you have any other land that come in, then you're able to have Battered Golem as your win condition. So it's definitely playable. It's a little slow into this pod. So I probably pitch it. This is another turn 1 Vexing Bauble. Okay. That screws Rel. You have a turn 2 Magda, turn 3 Professional Facebreaker, and then you have the ability to blow out Kinnan and Rogthras with this. So you're probably holding this up on turn cycle 1, using it. Turn 2, you're playing Vexing Bauble. And then turn 3, you're probably going Professional Facebreaker. Turn 4, Magda. It's a very slow hand, but it does blow out Rog and Kinnan with your Pyrokinesis, as long as you draw a red card, or if you're committed to, using Pinnacle Monk for that, which is perfectly fine in this case. So, it's slow, but a decent chance to win the game. Vexing Bauble after Kinnan and Rog is not necessarily where you always want to be. But it is what it is. You could definitely pitch this, but it does make sense too for this pod. It's just, you have to draw into Dwarves, otherwise you're screwed. So we have the One Ring, which kind of helps. Balin's Tomb helps with that. Yeah, the One Ring saves this hand, unironically. This is probably not keepable. You do have interaction, you do have a Dwarf. The Dwarf will be able to kill Rog on turn 2 if you have a land, but you might not. So Mulligan. Into this pod, turn 1 Cage is insane. It then incentivizes both Kinnan and Rog's Rogthrast to keep stuff up to deal with Rel. You have some stuff to deal with Rel yourself, like, or the board state in general. Pyrokinesis for pitching Tybalt's Trickery. You also have 2 vehicles which are helpful with one another, but you only have 1 land. So this is contingent on you drawing lands, and it's probably not good enough. This is going down to 6. You're going to keep this off the fact that you have 1, 2, 3... And then you have Pyrokinesis with a red card if you draw it. The problem is you don't have any other lands, so you're probably going down to 5 here, actually. Okay. This is perfectly fine. You have Glittering Caves. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you have turn 1, 3-tree mascot plus Grafdigger's Cage. And then you have turn 2 Magda. And then you're generating treasures, and then you go from there. That's going down to 5. That's a very strong game plan. New pod. Us, another Magda, Itali, Rogsai. You really need to be ahead in this pod as far as speed goes, or you need something specifically to stop Rogsai. Because Itali's probably not winning with double Magda off of flips. This is a turn 1 Magda plus Clown Car, which is good, but you don't have a second land. So you'll have to grab Springleaf Drum. That's perfectly fine. So you have turn 1 Magda, Clown Car, Springleaf Drum. Following turn, you have Axguard Cavalry, make 2 treasures. You can hold up Untimely Malfunction. This stops the other Magda. It also stops their Portal to Phyrexia if they somehow get it before you. And then you have Bottlecat Blast, which this is going to resolve and you're going to win the game. So, it's risky because if Magda keeps something to blow up our Magda, we're not coming back into the game, but sometimes you just have to take that risk, especially with Bottlecap in your hand. So this is turn 1 Dwarf plus Clown Car, turn 2 Magda, and then you're able to stop Rogsai from doing the thing. So you're able to do turn 1 Vexing Bauble plus Clown Car, and you're probably going to have to politic with the other Magda to say, hey, I can slow down Rogsai but it's going to put me back treasure generation. So you can't activate until I have an activation myself type thing. So that if you both portal, then whatever. But this is a decently keepable hand into this pod because it also shuts off Itali. You also have a way to turn a dwarf into an artifact, so that's not bad. And you can use treasures to get the One Ring into play if necessary. So I probably keep this as a second 7. It's risky as a first 7, but because of Vexing Bubble alone into Itali and Rogsai, you will need to talk to the other Magda as far as what would make you keep this hand. But you do have, turn 2 Magda into Dwarven Armorer, so you're not necessarily behind treasure generation-wise if they go turn 1 Dwarf, turn 2 Magda, right? Which is very common. So yeah, you keep this. So this is just some examples. I will make another video that goes a little bit more in depth. Maybe, you know, an hour or two of me and Rust going over things, and that'll be linked in the description below at some point.